stewards of the world we live in. One humanity seeking the healing and the good of all. We pray that we ourselves be the good we want to see and the change that we seek. Pray for inspiration. Amen.
Good morning to everyone. I am Carlos Piocos, co-coordinator of the Democracy Discourse Series project. Joining me to MC today's program is our lead coordinator, Dr. Ronald Holmes. We would like to thank each one for their attendance today. The DDS is a relatively new advocacy program under the De La Salle University's Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub. Its primary purpose is to provide support for the implementation of projects of selected public intellectuals from the Philippines and Malaysia. The projects, as we will be previewed later, cover a broad range of issues and concerns, but are weaved together by one objective: mobilizing greater public involvement to sustain democratization.
That's what you're getting also.
Or, as the cases of the Philippines and amplify across the last year, deter autocratization. We are aware that this objective is difficult to attain. However, through the DDS, De La Salle University hopes to modestly contribute to the protection of fundamental liberties and the free exercise of political rights. So on that note, to deliver the opening remarks, we invited the Vice President of the Republic of the Philippines, fellow academics, educators, and our public intellectuals and democracy advocates, the Vice President of the Republic of the Philippines, Her Excellency Maria Leonor Leni Verona Robredo.
Good morning, everyone. I hope we're all keeping safe and doing well. Congratulations to the organizers of this year's Democracy Discourse Series for a successful event despite the challenges brought by the pandemic. As I speak, we near the last month of the first quarter of the year. Today is a good time to take a step back, reflect, and share the lessons we have learned as we continue the work for healthier, stronger democracies around the world. The times are challenging for everyone, not least for liberals and Democrats around the world. The ideas we hold dear continue to come under attack as authoritarians tap into long held frustrations born of a lack of social mobility, entrenched, unjust social structures, and growing inequality. This inequality has become amplified due to the pandemic. The poorest communities are also the most vulnerable to disease and the economic havoc it is wreaking. Poor children, those without access to digital infrastructure, are the ones finding it most difficult to adjust to online modes of learning. Poor families are the ones dying first and dying the most, unable to even reach the steps of hospitals or unable to rely on a public healthcare system that is under tremendous strain. In such an atmosphere, demagogues, especially incompetent ones that have failed to decide based on science or exhibit the necessary foresight to minimize the impact of the pandemic, seize every opportunity to cast blame. And who else to blame, they say, but liberal democracy and its slow, messy processes? Who else to blame but the liberal democratic elite who stood in the way of a swift, decisive authoritarian alternative? The default response to these claims has been to assert the truth. Democracy has been the key to human progress over the last 2 centuries. Corruption and predatory economic structures are as much the enemy of liberal democracy as everyone else's. And yet, what we are realizing is that such debates over the value of liberal democracy only plays into the hands of the populist authoritarian. It only serves to further polarize society and become launch pads for further lies to counteract. This lies at the very heart of my message to you regarding democratic discourse. In an environment characterized by hostility and lies, it is necessary to take a step back and ask, why do people believe the lies? From where I sit, there is one fundamental gap screaming to be filled, a gap in listening. The lies persist because those who spread disinformation have been successful in building their own affinity with the public while eroding ours. To counteract this, then, to rebuild affinity, we must begin by going to our communities, by defaulting to empathy, by leaning towards the ground. This commitment asks us to be constantly vulnerable so that we can face the problems of society from a position of lived experience. To fulfill democracy's promise to build a fairer tomorrow, we must first offer solidarity in real time. This is the necessary shift which lies at the heart of these discussions today. It is, in fact, the only truly democratic response to the times. To engage as many people as possible, to hold real conversations, to hear real stories, and build real living connections. Because as the pandemic continues to show us, there is no better way through any crisis but together. I firmly believe that democracy can rise to the challenges it faces today, but only if we listen first and listen for real. I am confident that each of you is up to this challenge. Thank you and congratulations.
Morning. On behalf of DDS, I'd like to welcome all of you. I should spell that out. This is the Democracy Discourse Series. This is our second forum, and we're now at the part that I'll introduce our keynote speaker. Our keynote speaker is an eminent academician, economist, and is a fellow of the Academy of Sciences of Malaysia. He was born in Penang, Malaysia in 1952. He finished his basic and secondary education in a couple of Malaysia's top education institutions, Penang Free School and the Royal Military College. He proceeded to the United States to obtain his bachelor's degree, cum laude at Yale University, and his master's and doctorate degrees at Harvard University. Our keynote speaker spent more than 3 decades in the academe and is back in the academe from 1974 until 2005, teaching in several institutions such as the Science University of Malaysia, Harvard University, Yale University, the National University of Malaysia, the University of Malaya, and Cornell. He has also been a visiting fellow at Cambridge University and a senior research fellow at the Asia Research Institute of the National University of Singapore. From 2005 until 2015, our keynote speaker served in various capacities within the United Nations system. He was Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development in the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs from January 2005 until June 2012, and Honorary Research Coordinator for the G24 Intergovernmental Group on International Monetary Affairs. He subsequently served as Assistant Director General and Coordinator for Economic and Social Development of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN from August 2012 until 2015. Our keynote speaker has authored and edited many books and monographs, besides writing many academic papers and articles for the media. He's in the editorial boards of several learned journals. In view of his contributions to knowledge, with his foundational books on Malaysian economy, he was awarded the prestigious Wassily Leontief Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought in 2007. Fellow democracy advocates, friends, and guests, our keynote speaker, Professor Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram. Jomo.
Thank you very much, Ronnie. Thank you very much, Ronnie, for this kind invitation to join you this morning. Thank you also to the program for having me today. It's a great pleasure to be with you today, and I thought the historic significance of many things which are going on, especially in the Philippines, that I might depart from my original text to speak a little bit about the significance of the anniversaries. Yesterday, of course, was EDSA, the anniversary of EDSA, and that, of course, was a very historic turning point in the history of the Philippines, and particularly in terms of the democratic struggles of the 1980s. And that was a period when a great number of ideas came up, a great number of, and the typical Filipino creativeness. One of the ideas which came up with the Philippines, you have acronyms for everything. And one of the most creative acronyms ever invented, I think, at the world level, not just at the Filipino level, was the acronym acronym. And that referred to the anti-crony movement, which emerged during the 1980s. Against the cronies of President Ferdinand Marcos. This, of course, acquired a certain resonance across Southeast Asia and became a very important rallying point in the struggle against the presidency of General Suharto in the Philippines. And one of the slogans, in fact, one of the most important slogans during the period which led to his resignation was the slogan KKM. KKN referring to corruption, cronisma, and nepotisma. All, as you can tell, language words borrowed from the English language.
and arguably borrowed from the Catholic tradition. Nepotism, of course, refers to a phenomenon of corruption within the church when it was not uncommon for popes in long distant times to appoint their nephews, their nepotes, to positions of significant influence, which will relate to the theme of discussion today. But the second anniversary, which doesn't fall today, but it will only come about in less than 2 months, is the anniversary of the death of Ferdinand Magellan, as we know him in the English language, Fernão Magalhães in Portuguese, and later Ferdinand Magallanes in Spanish. Now, why is it important for us to mark this? Well, partly because I've been very much influenced by my wife's work in the last couple of years, particularly on the role of Malacca, but also because there is a connection, a very strong connection, and a heroic connection, if you will, between Malacca and Mactan. For those who don't know, Mactan is a small island next to Cebu City, where the airport for Cebu City is located. Why Mactan? Well, in April 1521, Magalhães, or Magallanes, as he was known then, arrived in Mactan with his reduced convoy of ships, and basically demanded that the people of Mactan accept his God, accept his king, and most importantly, hand over a tribute. And to proceed with that threat, he basically raised first one village on the island of Mactan, and then raised another village on the island of Mactan. And then, as he threatened to raise a third village, Lapu-Lapu, one of the local chiefs in Mactan, organized resistance, and later there was a duel with Magellan, and Magellan was killed. Now, under Magellan's will, his slave who had been renamed Enrique, was released, and he possibly was the first man to really circumnavigate the world, because Magellan did not quite make it back to the furthest point he had gone to, which was Malacca. But Magellan was the Mactan episode was not unique. Magellan was with Henry the Navigator, or Prince Enrique, when Enrique attacked the Morocco, present-day Morocco, or Maghribi as it was known then, under the Idrisiya dynasty, and then subsequently attacked Nagapatnam as part of the forces of Albuquerque in Nagapatnam in South India, which was the capital of the Tamil dynasty in South India. And then he was involved with the attack on Malacca in 1511, and where he captured a local whom he renamed Enrique. So that's how Enrique became his slave. I won't go into the rest of that story, but I think the Magellan story is important because we need to understand that our nation states in the world, many of the nation states in the South, in what is called the Global South, including the nation states in Southeast Asia, are really products of colonialism. And even the boundaries of Thailand, which was not formally colonized, are very much defined by colonialism. If you read the famous book by Tongchai Vichakul called Siam Mapped, you get a sense of this, of how Siam's boundaries expanded and then retreated. And of course, the four northern states of present-day Malaysia were previously part of Siam. So let me come now to trying to understand the subject which I have proposed for discussion today, which is the relationship between business, politics, and democracy in Southeast Asia. This insight that it's not a terribly original insight for me. It's an insight which almost anybody who have studied the politics of the South would be familiar with. This insight that the modern nation states of the South are states which were created by colonialism, in a sense, by imperial states, that by the settlement among imperial powers, particularly in the case of Southeast Asia after the Second World War. In the case of Malaysia, of course, we were variously colonized at different periods by a number of powers, the last few of which, of course, were Portugal, and then Holland, and then the British, and briefly the Japanese as well. And then, of course, in the case of the Philippines, the history of colonialism in the Philippines is a longer one in a sense, a very uneven one, but which profoundly, and especially the American period of the first half of the 20th century, has had a very profound effect on the political institutions of the post-colonial state. So in both cases, if we think about the so-called Westminster style parliamentary democracy, a mutated form of which we have in Malaysia, and the Philippine democracy and the institutions of Philippine democracy, we are able to trace much of it to late colonial influences. So what does that mean for us? What it means for us is that unlike the nation states of the West, it is not the rise of capitalism. It is not the rise of the so-called bourgeoisie. Remember that the bourgeoisie were the middle class. The bourgeoisie emerges as the middle class, and mainly in the cities against the landed interests which dominated the countryside. In the case of the colonial states, what happened basically is something slightly different. And where political power, it is that power is associated with politics. Power is associated with military power, with rule. And this is part of the reason why so many post-colonial states to this day are prone to not only to military coups d'etats of various types, but also very prone to the domination, the apparent domination by politics. In so-called more normal Western nation states, it is the other way around. It is usually power, the power of business, the power of landed interests, and more recently, the power of technological interests which dominate. And this, of course, has tremendous implications for all of us. If you think, for example, about our abilities or inabilities to cope with the COVID-19 pandemic, much of this is influenced by ongoing relations, which have to do with the influence of the relationship between business and politics and policy. So I'm referring, of course, to what is sometimes referred to as vaccine nationalism or vaccine imperialism, and the related phenomenon of intellectual property rights. intellectual property rights are a relatively recent phenomenon, and they have been greatly reinforced only in the last quarter century or so with the establishment of the World Trade Organization. And although South Africa and India and 2/3 of the members of the World Trade Organization support a waiver on the TRIPS agreement, the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Agreement at the WTO, they have not been able to get the rich countries to provide a waiver. Now, one should remember that all these exceptions to various rules have come about not through the beneficence of the powerful, but through struggles. So it was the prestige of Nelson Mandela, who came out of jail after more than two decades on Robben Island and elsewhere, who came out of imprisonment and became the president of South Africa in 1994, who then subsequently prevailed upon the world to introduce the public health exception to the TRIPS agreement. So under the public health exception, it is now possible in the world to have to exercise what are called compulsory national rights, and it's possible for us to produce our own generic medicines in certain as long as we comply with certain conditions which have been set in the agreement. But unfortunately, we have a situation where the rich countries have provided a great deal of money and guaranteed profits to the vaccine developers. One should remember that many vaccine developers have tried to develop vaccines and unsuccessfully. Australia, for example, has spent about $2 billion trying to develop a vaccine for COVID-19, and without any results, without any viable vaccine emerging. So a great deal of money has been spent to promote research in this area. And what we find now is that intellectual property rights are not being are being held as immutable. So it's very important for us to remember that power of business remains extremely strong, not only at the national level, which we tend to be preoccupied with, but also at the international level. And it stands in the way of asserting our democratic rights, our right, the human right to health, and so on and so forth. So this has very, very profound implications. So when we think about the relationship between business and politics, it's important to remember that at least in the South, the relationship is often moves in a different way. It is not a relationship where business asserts itself and tries to influence politics, but rather conversely, a situation where it is politics which often becomes the means by which you acquire wealth, you acquire capital, you acquire influence in other ways. And so the relationship becomes quite intimate. What colleagues in Malaysia have referred to as money politics, or politics in business, and so on. And of course, the Philippines, that slogan I referred to earlier, the whole slogan of cronyism during the Marcos years is a very potent reminder of how it was the influence to politics which enabled the cronies to accumulate, to secure business opportunities and to accumulate wealth. So this becomes very important for us to remember when we try to understand the relationship of business to politics and to try to begin to understand the difference. Now, many people would say, well, the United States of America was once a colony, and we don't quite have the same phenomenon which we have in much of the South in the United States. Well, I'm sure all of you still remember the 6th of January last month, when the very basic institutions of US democracy were undermined. But I would just remind you, that the first, I think it was of the first 14 presidents of the United States, the vast majority were slave owners. I would also remind you that General George Washington was not the largest slave owner. It was his wife who was the largest slave owner in the American colony. And it was General George Washington who was the largest property owner. And this you can see in various books on American history. So it is not as if you did not have prior wealth accumulation in the American colony, and it was precisely that which provided much of the support and the viability for the American Revolution beginning in 1776. But it's also very important for us to remember that in the Civil War of the middle of the 19th century, it was basically property interests of conflicting types which resulted in the Civil War. One should always remember that Abraham Lincoln did not start off wanting to end slavery. Abraham Lincoln wanted to keep the Union together. He strived, he made all kinds of compromises in trying to keep the Union together. And it was only because he failed that the Civil War happened, and he managed to mobilize, extend the support for the North through making alliances and so on with the movement for emancipation. So it's very important for us to remember that if, for example, if the South had prevailed, if the South had prevailed, we would have had a very different outcome in the United States. A United States which would have been very committed to free trade, for example, right from the outcome of that Civil War, free trade which would have continued. Whereas if you look at what actually happened, the United States only opened up from around the time of Kennedy. It was Kennedy who initiated the so-called Kennedy round of trade negotiations, which resulted in the opening up of the U.S. from the beginning of the 1960s. Before that, the United States was pretty much a closed economy, for almost a century. And it's very important for us to recognize that. And this was absolutely necessary for the rapid growth, the rapid accumulation, rapid industrialization of the United States. If not for the victory of the North, this would not have happened. So the kind of protectionism which you find in the United States during this period, this long century of American catching up, so to speak, was enabled by the outcome of the Civil War. Otherwise, it is very likely the United States would not be unlike, say, Australia, a country which is still very much a primary commodity producer, quite wealthy because it is quite efficient, but a very different type of economy from what it is today. And of course, a lot of this has to do with another figure from the American period, and that figure, of course, is Alexander Hamilton, the illegitimate son of basically a prostitute who migrated to the United States, distinguished himself in battle, attracted the attention of George Washington, became the first Secretary of State, died in a duel with the Vice President of the United States. But his ideas about what it takes to develop a country are far more influential, are far more relevant to developing countries all over the world today than the ideas of Adam Smith. Ideas of Adam Smith, which were developed in a very, very particular context, which do not address the whole range of challenges which we find in developing countries. So it's very important for us to recognize that although we find that in politics in Southeast Asia today, there is undoubtedly business there has been a significant expansion of local business interests. It is important to recognize that in most of our countries, and there are of course important variations in our countries, the power of transnational capital is still dominant. The power of transnational capital is still dominant, and transnational capital tends to be still tends to be quite parochial. It will not do very much in terms of investing in presidential candidates, for example, or particular political parties. But it will, so it is often left to the states, the governments, their powerful governments behind these transnational business interests, which influence these outcomes. And so what we often refer to as the historic role of the CIA in the post-war period, for example, has been very much influenced by the perception of the American states of what is in the interest of American business, for example. And this is, of course, is especially relevant to the Philippines, but it's also relevant to countries such as the other countries in Southeast Asia, including Malaysia. And part of the reason why it is attenuated in Malaysia is precisely because the ideology of the Malaysian state for the last half century or so has been one which has seen itself as furthering the interests of capital accumulation by a particular segment of the elite, namely the ethnic Malay elite. So the politics of domination in Malaysia has been one of ethnopopulism. Ethnopopulism has been dominant in this country, arguably since before independence. I would argue from the 1930s, when the British were having difficulties controlling the states, what is now Malaya, because of the challenges posed by the Great Depression and its consequences. So it's important for us to recognize that transnational capital continues to be dominant. Today, of course, for a variety of reasons, we do not have the kind of crude, direct intervention by the CIA in many situations as it used to be before. But we nonetheless continue to have such influences. And it is very interesting to see how certain regimes are much more welcome in Washington. And of course, Washington itself is changing. What was au fait with Trump was very different with Obama before him, or Biden today. And this is important for us to recognize. So one should not view the US state as static, and one should not view the Philippine state or the Malaysian state as static. It has changed in very, very important ways over this period. But what does all this tell us about the nature of political institutions and the prospects for democratic interventions? I think it is very important for us to recognize, as I suggested earlier, that many of our institutions have been very much influenced by the political institutions of late colonialism. So there are very important differences, I think, between let us say, the Philippines and Malaysia, for example. If we think about the Philippines, we have seen that by the end of the 20th century, it was only the Philippines which had local level elections. Local level elections did not exist in the rest of Southeast Asia, including Malaysia. They used to exist briefly during the 1950s and the first half of the 1960s, and then they were basically ended in the middle of the 1960s in Malaysia. In other parts of Southeast Asia, they have not been, there is no strong tradition of local level elections. But what has resulted from local level elections? In the words of a political scientist looking at the Philippines, I think it was Paul Hutchcroft, he basically argued that what you had is local bossism, okay? Bossism. And what does one mean by bossism? One basically means that you have a situation where, you know, somebody wins the election at the local level, you become the mayor, and you appoint your brother-in-law as the police chief, and so on and so forth. So it is basically sort of winner takes all and cronyism at the local level. And this has become very, very important and given rise to what Ben Anderson and others referred to as cacique democracy. Now, in Malaysia, we have very different institutions which have emerged, and these two are very different. But here I would like to make a different contrast, and a different contrast between trying to understand business and the process of economic development and the role of political institutions. So if you look at the Marcos period and you look at the Suharto period, you had two very different outcomes. So I like to make this joke when I teach, especially when I teach outside of Southeast Asia. I said, consider two Southeast Asian nations, both island nations, both ruled by dictators. In one of them, you have a growth rate of 3%. And the other one, you have a growth rate of 8%. Of course, I'm referring to particular periods. Now, why this contrast? Why this contrast between the Philippines and Indonesia? Both had dictators, both reprehensible for that reason, but yet you had very, very different outcomes. And those outcomes are very important because it allows those in power to buy off part of the opposition. And this is part of the reason why Suharto was strong. It was not just the power of the military and the support of the West, but other factors were very, very important. But the big difference in my view is the fact that unlike Indonesia, the Marcos regime was not even sure of its own security. So as they made money, to put it crudely, they took the money out. So the money made off the backs of the Filipino people went to Hong Kong, maybe Singapore, Honolulu, and elsewhere. Whereas whatever was made by the Suharto family and their cronies and the family, what was made there went back into the Indonesian economy because they saw the prospects for further accumulation. So in the old days, for example, if you arrived in Jakarta and you were trying to take a taxi, you would probably find, you would go for the blue taxi. And that blue taxi was owned by Suharto's wife and subsequently, I think, by one of his daughters. If you go drive into the city and you pass the tollways, that toll road was ostensibly built by his daughter, and she collects the tolls. So all of us contribute to his tolls. Now, one of the ironies, of course, in Jakarta is that despite building all these toll roads, you still have huge traffic jams. But be assured that when you pay tolls in the toll roads, you are probably contributing to the largesse of Suharto's daughter, Tutut. Okay, so you have these very different outcomes, you know, despite the similarities of having a dictatorship. And conversely, you do not have development, you do not have sustainable development and so on and so forth because you have democracy. And this is very important for us to begin because there are certain institutions which are not necessarily going to be lasting institutions, which are much more conducive to capital accumulation, to sustained growth and development, and others which are less so. And this is very important for us to try to understand the paradox of what is happening, for example, in China today. How do we understand China? Okay, according to our usual textbooks, China is not supposed to grow. Okay, China is, by its own claims, it's supposed to be a socialist economy with Chinese characteristics. I think what is probably much more accurate is that it is a capitalist economy with Chinese and Communist Party characteristics. Okay, and I think this is very important because it is the power of the Communist Party, Xi Jinping, which ensures a certain coherence of the Chinese state in terms of its actions and its ability to respond to challenges, both external as well as domestic. And so it has enabled the rapid capital accumulation which you have seen in China over the last few decades. Okay, and it is not clear what would have happened, for example, if Tiananmen had led to some kind of more liberal dispensation. It is not clear. It is not clear what would have happened. And it's very important for us to begin to recognize that part of the problem lies in our understanding of democracy, and part of the problem lies in our understanding of what liberalism itself means. Democracy, I will not try to get into right now, but I think it's very important for us to begin to recognize that the term liberalism means many different things in many different contexts. It is not unusual for people in the United States who are left of center to think of themselves as liberals, okay? But in Europe, in the United Kingdom, for instance, the liberals represent a particular political tendency which has its origins arguably in the 17th or 18th century. Okay, a particular view of the world, a particular individualist and utilitarian view of the world, which emerged during that particular period. But the liberal worldview was not unchanging. By the middle of the 19th century, John Stuart Mill, for example, famously recognized that it was absolutely necessary for the government to recognize that it had a role to play, and for the government to among other things, to enable the industrialization. Because remember, this was right soon after the so-called Industrial Revolution began in places like England. So this is important for us to recognize. Even Mill recognizes, and by the end of the 20th century, of the 19th century, sorry, John Hobson, another very famous English liberal thinker, argued that two things had happened despite the liberal capitalist dispensation. Two things had happened. First, you had a concentration of power, of wealth, a concentration of economic power, okay? And that concentration of economic power had in turn political ramifications, political consequences, political influences. And this is very important for us to begin to come to terms with. It was not as if it was inconsequential. And so you cannot talk about a liberal dispensation without recognizing that the basis for that liberal dispensation no longer exists. It no longer exists. And this is what Hobson recognized. And the second consequence which he argued was that the exigencies, the demands of late 19th century capitalism was such that it gave rise to what he termed imperialism. And that imperialism in turn was problematic because it involved rivalry among emerging capitalist powers. And then yet another English liberal, John Maynard Keynes, right after World War I, writing on the Treaty of Versailles, which is supposed to have ended World War I, he wrote a famous little booklet called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. And what he was arguing in that piece was that the peace would not hold. The peace could not hold precisely because it humiliated, it gave nothing to the losers, to Germany in particular. And he said that it would not hold, and sure enough, unfortunately, he was proven right. A decade later, we saw Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party mobilized on the basis of the humiliation of Germany post-World War II, where it had to give up even its meager colonies in Africa, such as Namibia and Tanganyika, now known as Tanzania. So this kind of humiliation was something which the Rooseveltian reformers recognized. And this is why the outcome of World War II was quite different, where you had the Marshall Plan which sought to rebuild Europe, ensure that Europe would not be humiliated. There was a plan. Morgenthau, who was the US Treasury Secretary under Roosevelt, and he argued that Germany was almost congenitally inclined towards militarism. That then the only way of preventing Germany from becoming a militarist imperialist power was to deindustrialize Germany. Can you imagine over 20 million Germans working on farms? Working that was something which was completely unrealistic. But this was Morgenthau's view about what should happen. So it became extremely important to have an outcome after World War II, which would not lead to yet another war. And this was why in Japan as well, the outcome was very different. MacArthur, who had made his reputation in the Philippines, subsequently was running Japan, and they made a deal of restoring the emperor, of restoring many of the people, including Class A war prisoners, were restored and were soon released, and so on and so forth. And this gave birth to the so-called Liberal Democratic Party, which continues to be the ruling party in Japan to this day. So I think it's very important to recognize that the institutions of politics, including the institutions of liberalism, of liberal politics, are very, very complex. And of course, today you have a different type of libertarian view of liberalism, which lives only in the minds of those who preach it. Because when confronted with the harsh realities of today, you see many of them resorting, as much of the Republican Party did, for example, in the United States. Many of them took refuge by supporting Trump, who was, of course, the ultimate ethno-populist and in a fundamental sense, antithetical to libertarian views. But they had no difficulty. Look at Rand Paul, for example, Senator Rand Paul, whose father, Ron Paul, was arguably the most consistent liberal in the US Congress. Rand Paul had no difficulties holding the line for Mr. Trump to this day. And so you begin to see that these are ideologies which are preached, but not consequential in the sense of actually influencing how power is exercised. Now, in Malaysia, of course, we have a very different situation, and I think it is tempting for me to get into some of the details about Malaysia, since I spent much of the end of the 20th century researching Malaysia, but I will not get into that right now. But I think it is very important for us to recognize that it is precisely because of the weakness of the institutions of democracy in our post-colonial states, in our post-colonial nation states, that you have this tremendous power of politicians and business. Now, the relationships between politicians and business are very complex and they are constantly changing, and much of it depends on context. Much of what has happened in the Philippines is very different from what has happened in Malaysia, for instance, or for that matter, Indonesia, or for that matter, Thailand, and so on and so forth. Each dispensation has its own ramifications, its own trajectories, and so on and so forth. But I think it is very important for us to recognize that if liberal democracy is, if democracy is to be more than an elite endeavor, if it is actually going to involve and mobilize and animate the vast majority of the populations of our countries, there has to be something in it for them. And people need to understand and appreciate this. Now, about 30 years ago, or perhaps more, there was very interesting debates in the Philippines. It was often to do with different political factions. But I think one of the consequences of some of those debates were to remind us of the realm of the possible. So you have this, in the Philippine context, you had the so-called Lib Dems, you had the Soc Dems, and so on and so forth, the Net Dems and whatnot. And then you had the so-called Pop Dems. And why do I mention the Pop Dems, although they are almost invisible in the Philippines today? The reason is because Pop Dems, more than anybody else, recognize the need for broad coalitions. The need for broad coalitions. Because ultimately, without those broad coalitions and a commitment to building and holding those broad coalitions, it is almost impossible to bring about change in many of our societies. So it is all very well for us to take the high moral ground and say, no, we won't work with these people because they're unacceptable for this reason or that reason, and so on and so forth. But without building those broad coalitions, of course, they should be built on a principled basis. Without building those broad coalitions, I do not see the prospects for advancing democratic outcomes. And this, I think, is extremely important for us to recognize, because the relationship between business and politics in the South, including Southeast Asia, is very different from the situations in which the world finds itself in many other certainly not. It's very different from the North. So the strength of these institutions, because most of these institutions have only come about in the post-Second World War period, they're not deeply imbued. They do not come out from popular traditions. And this is, I think, very important for us to recognize. So we need to begin to many of the terms which we use, including democracy. For instance, there are, I think it was David, I can't remember his name right now, who passed away a few years ago, who wrote about these different models of democracy, about 9 or 10 different models of democracy, which according to him have existed in the world, beginning with Athenian democracy and so on and so forth. And these things are useful as references, but I think ultimately they have to be part of our traditions, and they cannot be built without recognizing our traditions are very, very much conflicted traditions, and conflicted traditions going back, as long as we can remember and we are reminded of. Because one of the problems with Ben Anderson's formulation of the nation as an imagined community, one of the major problems with that is that the imagined community could be anything other than the nation as well. And this has been seized upon in the last 4 decades or so of identity politics by a whole range of ethno-populists who have invented national imaginaries. When you think about Narendra Modi and the BJP, RSS, which is the Hindutva organization at the core of the BJP, how they have been able to fundamentally transform their discourse to come out as Hindutva light, so to speak. But they have basically captured the imagination of the Indian electorate, and they are able to dominate at least the northern Indian Hindi belt of politics. If you look at what Mr. Trump achieved in the United States, 47% of the popular vote is no mean feat. It's no mean feat. If you think about Boris Johnson, although he is certainly less explicitly racist, look at how look at what he has done in trying to revive, for example, in looking at post-Brexit options and looking at the Commonwealth. So I think it is very important for us to recognize this, the variety of meanings. We have to recognize that, for example, there is a big difference between peace and Pax Romana or Pax Americana. Pax Romana was a peace enforced in the name of Rome, if not from Rome, in the name of Rome. Pax Americana is a peace enforced by arguably from Washington, but not solely on behalf of Washington, but also on behalf of others. And likewise, we know what the so-called East Asian co-prosperity sphere meant during the Japanese occupation, which led us nowhere. But it is their ability to recognize the appeal to victimhood, the ability to appeal to victimhood, which makes these ethno-populist ideologies so dangerous. They're so dangerous. So if you look at President Duterte, many of you many people in the world will certainly not see him as a model of democracy for one moment. But it's undoubtedly true that he managed to get almost 3/4 of the Philippine migrant workers' support because he represented during his campaign a particular imaginary about what the Philippines should be. And so it is important for us to recognize that it is these types of populist politicians, but I would argue populist politicians who have captured the imaginary. But the opposition to it should not be by rejecting populism altogether, but by constructing an alternative populist narrative on a different front. Why do I say populist? Because populism by its very nature seeks to transcend narrow class politics, for example. And that is very important. If you have a politics which is simply based on class, by its very nature, it excludes other people. So you need to have a broader appeal, and hence my argument about that you need to construct a new democratic tradition. Construct a new democratic tradition, but not one based on some kind of elite or foreign superimposition, but rather one which the population can relate to, and which comes out of the popular traditions of the societies concerned. This, in my mind, is fundamentally important if we are to move forward in these times. Let me stop here. Thank you very much, Ronnie, for this opportunity to talk to you. I do realize that this was perhaps not quite what you signed me up for, but I hope it has been of interest, and more importantly, that it would advance our discourse on democracy in order to make it much more relevant to the people of Southeast Asia, especially our own countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jomo. Thank you, Jomo. Actually, what you spoke about is something that's relevant to the theme. And I guess there are a number of attendees now who would like to provide comments or even ask questions. The Q&A section in this forum is open for those who would like to ask questions, and people could also raise their hands, and we could just unmute anyone among the attendees who would like to ask their question personally. So anyone likes to begin? And thank you, Jomo, for staying with us, at least for the open forum. Maybe questions also or comments from our public intellectuals from the Philippines and Malaysia.
I think we already have a question in the Q&A chat from Francisco Magno. Professor Jomo, the social contract theories, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, emphasized the importance of political education for citizens to combat false consciousness and political parties to provide citizens with vehicles for choice making as important enablers of democracy. In Southeast Asia, especially the Philippines and perhaps Malaysia, these institutions are token in nature. Would you suggest that political party strengthening strategies are still the way to go, given the bleak prospects in the horizon? Thank you for the wonderful talk, Kiko.
Thank you very much, Dr. Magno. I think we all work in very different conditions and we work with very different circumstances. Rousseau's view, of course, as you know very well, comes out of a view of what the formation of the human individual should be. He even has views about how the child should be raised and so on and so forth. And this is all part of Rousseau's view of what should be the case. Unfortunately, we work in circumstances which we inherit. We have limited ability to influence the circumstances in which we inherit, and so we need to begin to address the circumstances which we inherit in ways which are realistic. And I'm not sure that political parties are necessarily the way to go, but they are obviously part of the canvas. I think if we completely bypass political parties, we are, for various reasons, choosing not to use one of the options which is readily available, which is legitimate for those of us who have political parties to work with. Don't forget that some people do not have those political parties to work with. For example, consider the circumstances of our Southeast Asian neighbors, our ASEAN neighbors in Myanmar right now. So I think it's very important for us to recognize that we all work in different circumstances, and there's no one size fits all way forward. But I think it is important to recognize that the democratic discourse, democratic aspirations only have meaning to many, many people who are struggling at the margins of life if it has some bearing on their condition. And it is that, it is not some kind of abstract Athenian ideal or anything like that which will necessarily appeal to them. So insofar as political parties do contribute to that discourse, I certainly see that as important. Now, in the process of doing so, I do think political education is very, very important. But I see this as not necessarily one which is done only by political parties. For example, I still remember, and the current Pope, for example, comes out of a tradition which is familiar with it during the 1960s and 1970s, and arguably even in the 1980s. There was a very strong, in the Korea, they called it the Minjung theology, In Latin America, they call it Teología de la Liberación, and so on and so forth. So you had very, very important views in Thailand. I still remember people talking about dharmic liberation, and so on and so forth. So you have many, many different traditions. It could be moral traditions, religious traditions, ethical traditions, all of which can contribute to this. So I do think that political parties, insofar as they may be one forum for doing so, and one should never think of political parties as monolithic. You know, as much as the leaders may wish it to be monolithic, there are generally areas of contestation as well. And it's very important for us to recognize their potential in that regard. So I would say, yes, we have something. Rousseau is still relevant, but perhaps not in the way which he might have suggested. Thank you.
Okay, we have a number of people who raised their hands, so probably I'd call them first, Jomo.
Sure.
The first one is one of our public intellectuals from the Philippines, May Paner, and then we have Professor Mary Roselis from Ateneo, and another public intellectual from Malaysia, Gayatri, is also going to ask questions. So first, May.
Hi, good morning, sir. I was very interested in the part of your talk when you said broad coalitions are important. And I would just like to seek for your comment because I think here in the Philippines, most especially, it is just so hard to unite the different forces. I mean, I am one who have been trying so hard to do that because here mostly people like to remember the past instead of conversing with the future. And so it's very, very frustrating. But I think it is also very, very important for us to be able to do that is really that we have to be in touch with, to be collectively in touch with our humanity. Can you please comment on that, sir?
Thank you very much, May. I share your frustration, and I'm sure many people listening in and many people beyond share your frustration with the difficulties of building and maintaining broad coalitions. Building a coalition is challenging enough, maintaining it is even more challenging very often. But it so happens that tomorrow night, I will be, tomorrow morning, I'm speaking with a great admirer of Rizal, Anwar Ibrahim, who has argued about humane economics. And obviously, what you aspire to and is something which I'm sure seeks has a particular meaning and sensibility embedded in your understanding of humanity and humanism and so on. Unfortunately, the word human, precisely because it has broad appeal, has been appropriated and used for all kinds of different things. Okay, and I want to underscore this, because words are often appropriated, and so for example, in my profession, I'm supposed to be an economist. My profession, more than half a century ago, an economist came up with the idea of human capital. It is completely flawed theoretically. It is flawed theoretically and so on and so forth, but it didn't prevent him. And now everybody talks about human capital as if it is a significant and meaningful economic concept. It is not, but it doesn't prevent any people from appropriating it and using it in that way. Now, the latest Human Development Report, okay, so about 3 decades ago, the UNDP, United Nations Development Program, decided to come up with an alternative to the World Bank's World Development Report. And they published 3 decades ago something called the Human Development Report, which Omoto Shen a famous Indian economist, helped to conceptualize, although he has more recently distanced himself from the report for some important reasons. Now, the latest issue of the Human Development Report for the year 2020 is about the Anthropocene age, the Anthropocene threat. Okay, now anthrop, as you know, basically means human. And the Anthropocene threat is where humanity, by privileging itself, has now conquered and transformed and arguably is destroying nature. Okay? And so you can see that by putting ourselves at the center of existence, of all existence, they are arguing, and many people would share this view, that we have destroyed nature. We have destroyed the very conditions of our own survival and our own existence. Now, we can debate this view, but I think it is very important to recognize that a lot of this was done in the name of advancing the human condition. Okay, so you can see how problematic words have become, you know, and the converse can also be true. Let me give you an example. During the 1960s, there was a military dictatorship, which in Korea, and the military dictatorship led by General Park basically pursued a number of policies, and Democrats in Korea and the world over were opposing him. But General Park undoubtedly did a lot of things to accelerate economic development in Korea. But some academics based in the United States sought to discredit him by using the term repression. So Park was being criticized for repressing the political opposition, but the economists used the term repression to refer to financial repression, that General Park was repressing the financial markets so that financial markets were no longer able to function effectively, according to them. In fact, what Park did was to keep the interest rate low so that industrialists could borrow cheap and rapidly industrialize, which, as you know, Korea succeeded in doing. So you can see how words are used. You know, words are used to convey certain messages. You know, so I mean, I took an easy shot by using Pax Romana, okay, earlier, right? So you have a peace which is imposed in the name of Rome, or the peace imposed in the name of Washington, but you know, but is that peace? Okay? So we need to begin to interrogate even the vocabulary we use, but of course, you know, we can get into a situation where it's almost impossible to have a conversation. So we don't want to get into that kind of situation. So I appreciate what you are saying, but I also am warning that what we face in the world today is a situation where many people, where many words, our language which is full of progressive potential, has been appropriated and used sometimes against us. And so it is very important for us to be just careful about that. So just to reinforce, I share your pain, I share your frustration, but I think appealing on the basis of a common humanity may not be enough to do the trick. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Jomo. I think Mary Loselis has a question. Mary, are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Jomo, nice to see you again. Greetings to your lovely wife, whom is a very good friend of mine. Anyway, I mean, thank you for really giving a new kind of framework, at least to my thinking, about dealing with that. I'm actually teaching a course on NGOs, the state, and business sector to try to sort out what that all means. So you're very helpful. Let me just then say, I guess what my thinking and my questions are, the whole role of civil society, and that involves many academics, media, and NGOs, community associations, and so on. How you see that now in, in these particular times as we're hoping for changes in away from the kind of negative populist approaches to more positive populist approaches is what you're saying. So what we've seen in the Philippines is this very strong civil society. Let's just focus on NGOs because that's the part I know best. Have contributed significant changes, and perhaps one of the most important findings of more recent times is how, from a group that thought that they should promote democracy at grassroots, many have recognized now that they really have to learn from the community groups because they have learned that people have their ideas. There's a sense of strong fairness in community groups, and they sort it out themselves. And that those outside, like the middle class CSOs, can learn from that. So that has been, I think, a big transition, over the last, 30 to 40 years. But what has now, all right, so now we are faced with what you're saying. It has to be a grassroots generated reformulation of how the society thinks about itself and acts. And that they, the majority, 70, 80% of so-called grassroots, whether urban poor, rural poor, indigenous people, that majority part of the more disadvantaged population still with different levels, how does that force then begin to take over? And what are the roles of NGOs, faith-based groups which have social development entities, and even the so-called radical left, who are also working in similar communities, although the political, ideologies differ there. And I guess the next issue then is we have the advantage of social media now, which we didn't have 40, 30, during the 1980s. So there's now social media. So perhaps you could give us some insights, if you know of any evidence or what you think might be the role now of civil society organizations, but focus very much on NGOs, which, by the way, we know are mainly headed by women, which I think makes a big difference because women are much more comfortable with being in everyday issues at community level. So they connect much better with community groups. And we know, certainly for urban poor, that the leaders are women for the most part. All right, so that's really my question. To summarize, what are NGO roles today in the context of social media to enable that force from the communities to rise, recognizing also that social media is very much controlled by business. So that link is also significant. So could you please comment on that? How do we go forward? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. It's so wonderful to hear from you. I still remember going to the IPC 45 years ago.
Yeah, I was there.
Almost to the month, actually next month. But it's so wonderful to hear from you. Unfortunately, as you probably know, marrying a Filipina woman has meant that I visit the Philippines less socially. When I do visit the Philippines, I spend much less time getting a sense of what is happening on the ground and so on and so forth. So I do not have a sense of what is happening on the ground as far as civil society organizations are concerned. I know that some of my weekly writings are being distributed in some groups, but I'm not quite sure what's happening on the ground in the Philippines. So it's very difficult, to be very honest, to meaningfully speak to the situation in the Philippines today. I do think that that depending on circumstances, one needs to turn to all types of civil society organizations. I have been recently in touch with some friends in India who are in NGOs, whose NGOs have been are being closed down, or some of their leaders are being attacked and so on. So these are tricky times for many people in different parts of the world. So I don't really have a sense of what is happening in the CSO world or the NGO world. And I think the distinction you make is very correct, that the two are not necessarily the same. There are also civil society movements which are not necessarily captured by any particular organizational permanent or ongoing institute form. And this has been very important. If you think, for example, about the ongoing farmer protests in India, which have involved hundreds of thousands of farmers, but mainly from the Punjab. This has, of course, has been very, very important in India, and has very important implications in terms of. But if you're looking to a particular NGO, of course there are several NGOs which would claim to speak for them. We will be hard pressed. So a lot of this is contextual. And it would be pretentious for me to say anything about the Philippines today. But let me go to your other point, which I'm not sure was your major point, but I do think it's a very major point. I think what has distinguished a great deal of the recent mass mobilizations in different parts of the world has been the increasing role of women. And this, I think, is something to be considered. It is not across all societies, but I think there is a lot to be said about the role of women in many of the movements which have come about in recent times. These are women whom we don't know about. These are women whose names do not make the headlines and so on and so forth. But they are all extremely important in most of the mobilizations, precisely because I think, as you correctly note, they are much more connected to communities, and communities are important for any kind of popular mobilization, and they are much more connected with they are sensitive to the vagaries of income, of welfare at the household level, at the family level, at the neighborhood level, and so on. So there is a lot to be said for that. At the same time, I think one has also to recognize that in this age of COVID, for example, women leaders all over the world, political leaders, prime ministers, presidents, and so on, have grosso modo generally done so much better than the male leaders. Male leaders have come across as petty, as parochial, and so I can add a number of many other epithets. But in contrast, I mean, you have leaders like Jacinta Ardern, or very importantly, I'm no great fan of hers, but even somebody like Angela Merkel has been very, very important in suggesting a third way for Europe, being neither in the Russian camp or the American camp, and so on and so forth. So all this has been very, very women thinking outside of the box. The role of Mary Robinson from Ireland, and continuing to provide leadership of the elders. The elders is mainly a male group, but it is she who has kept it energized. So person after person, you find that for reasons which are, which may have to do with the different socialization of women, the different psychology of women, the problems of machismo, which My daughter is interested in questions of masculinities. These are serious issues which we have hardly paid any attention to, and I think it is important for us to pay far more attention to them. So thank you for raising this whole question of the role of women and the leadership of women in these very challenging times. Thank you.
Okay, we have 3 people who raised their hands, and there are a number of questions in the chat box also, but we'll prioritize those who raised their hands. Jomo, is it okay for us to collect those 3 questions first?
Sure.
So these are Gayatri, I have Nimrus, and Sok. Gayatri?
Thank you. Good morning, Professor Jomo. Thank you so much for your talk. It's really, really a lot of food for thought, really. I think a lot of us are probably also attracted to this, your question as to what is this democracy that we can imagine, that is different from, or it's not reliant on the elite, consensus per se. But I wanted to ask maybe a little bit of clarification, because you mentioned the issue of class. And I wanted to maybe just pick your brains on whether what we have now is actually the failure of in addressing precisely the class inequalities and the challenges. And earlier you talked about how in Malaysia we have this ethno-populism that has really shaped our politics, and that we have maybe not looked at the challenges of class differences. And this is the reason why we are where we are today as well, that the sort of allegiances and loyalty or perceived loyalty to that ethnic identity takes over compared to some of the other more fundamental issues. So I just wanted to know whether you are proposing a different way of addressing these class struggles, so to speak, or do we need to look at a different dimension completely? I'm inclined to think that in a lot of our analysis and even analysis of what happens and transpires on social media also can be related to some of these class inequalities, in addition to the other identities that become a problem. And the second, I just wanted to refer to Myanmar, and I think actually they do have quite strong political parties. I mean, it has been under a regime that prevented the kind of work that they could do. And I think what we see today, as it was in 1990, as it was in 2008, is this desire to have that the civilian political parties actually rule. And I think it's not the absence of political parties, but the controls that the military have. So maybe just a bit more of your thoughts on how you viewed the relationships there of the public and the political parties. I think Brunei is probably one country that doesn't really have political parties at all. But I think it's actually very vibrant in Myanmar, despite whatever that we see happening there. There's a sense of a desire, a very strong desire for democratic change. So maybe just your thoughts on that. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'll just collect 2 more, Professor Jomo.
Sure.
I think we have, wait, I'm just opening my chat box. Nimrus. Nimrus, are you there? We're not getting him. Sok.
Yes. Thank you, Ron, and thank you, Professor Jomo, for that very interesting lecture. I'm very glad that you took up the issue of women's participation in politics. But I've been working on this area for the longest time. But I've reached a point where I believe that we shouldn't only be looking at numbers. We should go beyond numbers. We should look at the kind of women who are elected into office, because there are women who are really not addressing gender issues. In fact, their positions are counterproductive. And we have seen that in the Philippines. We have seen that in many other countries in Southeast Asia. So that's the point that I'd like to stress, beyond numbers. What role, they play in transformative change. But the point that I'd also like you to address, since the topic is democratic discourse in the time of the pandemic, is how women fare in this pandemic. particularly because the care economy is in full drive now. So when we say that, you know, in the pandemic, you know, you have to really go for like home-based schooling, that you have to really stay home most of the time, the burden is on the women's shoulders, because we know that in the division of household labor, the burden is really heavily carried by women. So most of them will cook, will wash clothes, will, you know, clean up, and at the same time we're asking them to teach their children, because you know, now it is home-based education, and in most of our countries, they do not really have any access to internet. They do not have access to digital devices. So if you would care, Professor Jomo, to please address the care economy where women dominate and which really in full drive in the pandemic. Thank you very much.
Should I go, Ronnie?
Yeah, that's okay. We can respond.
Okay, thank you very much. First, Gayatri, I think, you know, I think class is behind a lot of things, right? And I've devoted a lot of time to trying to show that class underlies a lot of things. But unfortunately, not very few people see it that way. And that's important, because you are trying to mobilize people on the basis of what they think rather than what they should think. Okay? And that makes the world of difference. So we will find that there are people who have all kinds of views which we may not agree with. But if we start, if we do not build a coalition, recognizing that there will be differences on many issues, it will be very difficult to do any meaningful coalition building. That was the thrust of what I was arguing. Now, let me say that at least as far as Malaysia is concerned, according to the official data, actually, income inequalities have gone down. And I do think that may not be inaccurate. But a lot of it has to do with the way we measure it, right? If a wealthy person gets income, and the income is in the form of the accumulation of new assets, it may not reflect itself in terms of income. Okay, it may reflect itself, or if that income is taken away. You know, when the Panama Papers were published about 5 years ago, Malaysia, outside of the US and Europe, Malaysia was the highest outside of Latin America, and sorry, outside the Americas and Europe. You know, it was just incredible how many Malaysians were there. So you obviously have a lot of wealth accumulation going on outside. Now, Malaysians are obsessed with numbers, right? So we have, you know, this so-called 30% target, right? And who does it involve? It involves a very small slice of the population, okay? But there is enough of a trickle down through things like an institution which is very Malaysian called the Amanah Saham Bumiputra, for example, where there is some trickle down. And one cannot deny that there is some trickle down, okay? So it is very important to recognize that regimes, to preserve their legitimacy, do undertake certain kinds of reforms. They do undertake certain things. When the British were deciding what to do in the early 1950s, you know, they instituted a lot of reforms. The Labour Party of Malaya was allowed by the British Special Branch. And you cannot say that this was the period because of the Labour Party being in power in London. In fact, Attlee lost the 1951 election. But the major institutional reforms were basically partly intended to win hearts and minds because there was a communist-led insurgency they had to deal with. So these are the realities we need to recognize, that there are, you know, that reforms are undertaken for a whole variety of reasons, not just because the people are necessarily successful in advancing their demands. And so I think it is important, therefore, to recognize that while class is very important in terms of analysis and so on and so forth, and I do it all the time, and I'm sure you do and others do as well, it is very important to recognize that that cannot become the basis for so once you insist that this becomes the basis, then you almost immediately isolate yourself from anybody else who might otherwise be sympathetic to the things you're fighting for. That's the thrust of my point. On the question of Myanmar, firstly, I think it's important to recognize that Brunei did have an election. Yeah? Brunei did have an election in 1961, and the People's Party of Brunei, or the Party Rakyat Brunei, won 51 seats contested. Okay, it was the British who was still the colonial power in Brunei at the time, who basically infiltrated the PRB and undermined what was purportedly a rebellion. Okay, yes, Brunei did have an election. It was and it was won by the Populist Party of Brunei, the People's Party of Brunei. Now, there are many similar formations in Myanmar, but one has to recognize also that whatever one's sympathies for Suu Kyi's current predicament, Suu Kyi endorsed the military repression against the Rohingya, okay, and military repression against other ethnic minorities at different times at different periods over time. And this is very important for us to recognize, you know. And so I think we are dealing with a very complicated situation in Myanmar, and one cannot dismiss the appeals of ethno-populism in the context of Myanmar as well. Now, going forward, and by the way, let me be very clear that for ethno-populist minority groups who feel very oppressed, or ethno-populist movements such as in South Africa, who are historically oppressed, even though Black African South Africans comprise the majority of South Africans. You know, the fact that they are ethno-populist should not necessarily disqualify from talking to them or from working with them as appropriate. Now, but also recognizing the limitations of that kind of conversation. On this second question of the moving away from the numbers, and I very much obviously share that sentiment in my response to Mary earlier. But let me emphasize that the problem of the intensification of the burden on women is not simply a question of the intent of the greater care work. You know, many of us are unaware, or we don't pay enough attention in many of our societies to the problems of how should I put it, say violence against women, for example. Violence against women in Malaysia, where very little violence against women is actually reported, the number of incidents of reports of violence to the police, okay, in these difficult times, in COVID times, has more than doubled in the last year. Okay, so you can imagine that the condition out there is far more serious, and with reduced incomes, for families. You know, you can imagine in many societies, you know, that girl children are subjected to marginalization in terms of the food and so on and so forth. And this is, you know, Malaysia is supposed to be on the cusp of becoming a high-income country. But if you look at the problems of malnutrition in Malaysia, micronutrient deficiencies of vitamins and minerals, they are atrocious. You know, about half of adult girls, by adults, sorry, girls who have begun menopause, for example, and so on, about half of them, okay, are anemic. They do not have enough blood iron. And so the influence of these new diets promoted by transnational companies and their Malaysian imitators, and I'm including things like, you know, very convenience foods such as instant noodles. You know, all this has had a tremendous imposed a tremendous burden on people's lives. The number of, you know, we recently, my colleagues recently did a study of life expectancy. Malaysian life expectancy has gone up from about 61 to about 76 over the last 6 decades. 61 to 76, quite impressive. But healthy life expectancy has also, healthy life expectancy has gone up much less. And the main reason is because of poor diets, of very poor diets. So we have a lot of problems now, which, you know, type 2 diabetes is very widespread now, you know, and so on and so forth. There are all kinds of self-inflicted problems, if you want to put it that way, which we face in Malaysian society right now, which we are in denial about, or which we do not pay enough attention to. So there are a whole range of problems which have been brought about by the pandemic. And undoubtedly women have borne the burden, but I think it is also important that we should not ignore how poorly men are coping as well, how boys are coping as well, you know. And let us all remember that stay in shelter lockdowns are an unnecessary response, In fact, if we are serious about learning from our neighbors in East Asia, if you look at Japan, if you look at Korea, you look at Taiwan, you look at China itself outside of the 3 provinces around Wuhan city, if you look at Vietnam, if you look at Laos, if you look at Kerala in Southwest India, you will see instance after instance, they have all been able to control, I would not say eradicate, because it has not been eradicated, to control the pandemic without resorting to stay in shelter lockdowns. This is very important. Why did we in the Philippines and Malaysia succumb to this? There was absolutely no need for this to happen. But unfortunately, you know, this is what has happened. I think you have some other people who want to ask questions, so let me stop here, Ronnie.
Yeah, we have a number of questions in the chat box. Actually, we have 6 people there, colleagues in the academe from Ateneo and LaSalle. Jomo, because I think we're also pressed for time and you have another webinar, what I can do is probably send you those questions and maybe we can email those.
Is there one which you feel must ask, or you don't know what?
There are 2 questions here that probably we can ask also. Some of the questions have been answered, you know, in your response to other questions. One of our public intellectuals has a question here, and this is Joe. Joe, you want to express the question? You want me to read it?
Sure, I can read it.
Okay.
So said, yeah, thank you for your really thought-provoking keynote. One of the, I think I actually asked a similar question. Maybe you said if democracy is going to be more than an elite endeavor, then we need to there needs to be something in it for them. I guess in it for the people not in the elite. So I guess I'm trying to wonder or ask you, what could it be? What this could be? What could it? What could or should be in it for people? So what narrative of democracy needs to be constructed for people to feel that it is relevant in any way to their lives? And how can this word then democracy be given meaning to those who are not in the elite? Or has it how far away from its meaning have we gone?
Thank you, Joe. My simple answer would be accountability. I think a lot of people just feel frustrated that governments, authorities are not accountable, and the pressure for accountability is very great. The desire for accountability is very great. If you just ask ordinary people what they feel most frustrated about, they feel most frustrated about the fact that nobody explains things to them, treats them as if they're stupid. You know, take for example COVID-19. You know, in Malaysia we have this term called SOPs, and people think SOPs are actually regulations. SOPs are standard operating procedures. This is just the norm. They're not meant to be, you know, but you have this conflation of very different ideas precisely, and when people realize that those authorities are unaccountable, you can see a tremendous desire for accountability. And once accountability is linked to the democracy, I think, you know, I think you will have a popular movement. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Jomo, and thank you, Joe. I think we've reached the point where we would have to thank Jomo, who has given us valuable time today, despite his busy schedule. And it was really an interesting talk. Professor Jomo, I'll send you the other questions that have not been replied. A good friend of ours, Walden, says hello also. You can see his comment in the question and answer box. So the others who raised their questions, we will just send you the responses by email. So once again, on behalf of De La Salle University, Southeast Asian Research Center and Hub, and the Democracy Discourse Series, I'd like to thank Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram for giving us the time today and the most insightful keynote speech. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we move to sort of the second half of the program for today. So we are proud to present to you all of the DDS Public Intellectuals and give a brief background on their projects. So we have prepared a short video that briefly captures the work of our public intellectuals for the past 2 years.
The Gobierno Project is an interactive theatrical performance that gives audiences the opportunity to create their ideal government, reimagine and design cities, propose new governmental policies and laws, to be shared and recorded in their own documentaries. Through this project, we wanted to bring people together in a safe space where people can share their concerns and raise important issues regarding their country, as well as share their hopes for the future. Imagine possibilities and accomplish more as a collective rather than individually.
The project that I've been doing over the last year actually has been prompted by the 2018 general elections in Malaysia, which opened up opportunities and spaces to discuss and involve young people in political discourses a lot more. And one of the other areas in which there's been now a heightened interest is in digital media literacy. Now, a lot of things have happened since that milestone elections in 2018. But what remains is that we have seen basically the genie is out of the bottle, that in fact we do need to have much greater participation among young people claiming a stake in the national politics. Very quickly, the project that I've been involved in has involved, or at least has included doing sentiment analysis on social media to try and understand how young people converse online, particularly on Twitter, looking at different languages, what sort of issues that spark their interest or generate reactions, and using that, then we try to also open up topics for discussion. A lot of it has revolved around the environment, political processes, getting involved in politics, what to do with the lowering of age for voting, what does it mean as a young person, and also, showing a lot of concern also about the levels of ethno-nationalism in our political discourses. So we've used the feedback from our analysis to open up these conversations with different groups. Our team has also worked with UNICEF and other youth bodies to launch and carry out webinars and workshops for young people on digital media literacy, to be able to distinguish false information or accurate information, how to be a much more literate person, especially on social media. Now, our project has allowed us also to reach out to different groups of students and associations who are now interested to take this on and sort of expand these activities. So we are still talking to some of these groups, but this project has really allowed for conversations among young people and also with other stakeholders to really raise their participation and their stake in the public discourses.
For this project, I decided to come out with a series of videos explaining the inner workings at the Philippine House of Representatives. For instance, how certain big businesses are affecting the process of legislation, how they are influencing, if not controlling, certain congressmen in making policy decisions, in making certain pieces of legislation. Also, some of the episodes were devoted to explaining the basic responsibilities of a member of Congress here in the Philippines, and also why, for instance, there's a lot of jostling for position when it comes to the selection of members of the certain committees at the Philippine House of Representatives. These, I think, would be able to help Filipino voters make sound or good decisions in next year's elections, especially in selecting members of the House of Representatives here in the Philippines.
Big tech companies incentivize higher engagement to collect and provide as much data about their users to advertisers. So what happens when the likes of Amazon, Apple, Facebook, or Google know about us and our interests? Well, we receive ads and postings that accurately reflect our interests. And when we see things we like, it maximizes the time that we spend on their sites. A passive selective exposure, a nudge to our behavior. It's a virtual cycle, a confirmation bias machine. So the truth has a habit of being boring, even a little dull. However, conspiracies are exciting. And as we know, rumors and conspiracy theories have long been around. So what's the difference if they occupy the online social network?
Hi, my name is Tina Camelia, and I'm a journalist who's been studying misinformation within the Malay-speaking online community. Everything you've just heard is a broad overview of the infodemic that the world is currently facing. However, when we zoom into targeted populations, and as the lines between social media and news media become more blurred, just as much as geopolitics, language, and cultural practices play a crucial role in the effective dissemination of hyper-localized disinformation campaigns, tackling misinformation too requires a refined approach. Because while there are public discourses on misinformation both in online and physical spaces, they have largely been in the English language for the urban educated, hardly the most vulnerable group when it comes to the threats of misinformation. And without the language and literacy to engage in nuanced conversations about misinformation, can its threats really be understood? So let's start with a simple idea, an introduction to the history, science, and business model behind the mainstreaming of misinformation and how it influences user behavior from the idiot box to the voting box.
In May 2016, Rodrigo Duterte, then mayor of Davao City, won a landslide victory in the Philippine presidential elections on a campaign centered on eradicating drugs and criminality in the country, a goal that the president maintains must be achieved even if authorities resort to violence. As of December 31, 2020, government figures revealed that 6,011 had been killed in police anti-drug operations, mostly from poor families across the country. Meanwhile, 23,327 deaths are still under investigation, including those killed by unknown gunmen and vigilantes. The victims do not end here. Beyond this death toll, thousands more continue to suffer from the violence and trauma of this government's drug war. They are the fathers, mothers, widows, and orphans left by the dead. They too are victims. For the past few years, I have witnessed these families grapple with grief amid poverty, all while desperately seeking for justice. Many of them are mothers who lost their sons, women who now share a common cause. I've seen how violence and death change the life of a child. It is always abrupt. How their innocence is swallowed by fear and darkness. Grief is insurmountable for many of them, and it spills into their words and games, their dreams and nightmares. But there are also those who refuse to be victims. In community rehab programs, I witness how the very people dehumanized by Duterte's drug war refuse to be reduced to their sins. Every day they are scared. Every day they are tempted. But they are not just victims anymore, but survivors.
The history of pandemics will reveal that xenophobia is part and parcel of pathogens. Organizations who had long worked on migrant issues were divided as to the cause. Some felt it was the work of government cyber troopers, set out to create a common enemy and unify the public against them. Others felt it was latent Malaysian racism. The government, however, was high-handed in the treatment of undocumented workers, rounding them up in army trucks and sending them to detention centers. Images of barbed wire, of crying women being herded onto trucks, and children as young as 5 years old in handcuffs spread quickly, despite efforts by the FRU to intimidate journalists. Foreign news agencies were accused of spreading lies about the treatment of undocumented migrants. Malaysians became deeply divided by these reports, and ugly xenophobia reached its apex with activists receiving hate messages and threats. Some argue that kita jaga kita should be kita jaga semua, asking that we take care not just of each other, but of everyone. The pandemic was bigger than all of us. Activists and artists worked together for several days of art and activism to celebrate the humanity of migrants under the banner Migrant Juga Manusia. The Migrant Juga Manusia hashtag trended on Twitter, but the migrant issue continued to divide and continues to divide people even today. The Refugee Festival, an annual festival that hasn't been in place since 2017, went online, but the organizers felt that many refugees did not want to participate for fear of repercussions. An Al Jazeera report on the treatment of migrant workers sent the government and half the population into a bitter frenzy. It became a country deeply divided. What was clear was that 60 years of race-based politics was translating itself into anti-foreigner sentiment. My theatre company did a Zoom production of a play called Para, a play that deals with race relations in Malaysia. In the play, 4 young friends of different backgrounds quickly become divided along racial lines. All it took was for one incident to split the friends and bring racial inequalities and a history of racial hurt and fear to the surface. If everyone is a pendatang or immigrant, asks one of the characters, then who is the tuan rumah? Who is the master of the house? All these anti-immigrant sentiments brought into focus our cultural baggage of deeply embedded racialized discourse and politics.
Watching this spectacle of terror night after night, I felt a deep unease welling in me. Why wasn't I feeling anything? What happened to my conscience, my capacity to feel? As an artist whose lifeblood is built on empathy and engagement, I feared that my very heart had deserted me. I had to do something. Maybe it was despair, maybe I was desensitized, but whatever the reason for that gaping emptiness I felt, I knew I had to confront it and find my center again. Of course, what can I do but turn to art? I called my friend Maynard Manansala, a playwright, and together we found ourselves with the mothers, the children, the widows and orphans of the so-called war on drugs. I wanted to hear their stories for myself. Passing reports of how and when their lives were brutalized did not suffice. I was interested in conversation. I wanted to listen to their hearts as a way of listening to mine. In the face of unspeakable violence, I wanted to know, how do we feel? How can we cope? What can we do to assuage, to survive, and perhaps to fight back? How can we restore the dignity and humanity, not just from the victims and their families, but from all of us fellow citizens who bear witness daily to mass murder and impunity? Slowly, I realized if I can bring these conversations to more people who are willing to share that transformative experience, then there in the process is my living, loving heart as an artist.
Surrender, surrender, tajak, tajak, surrender, surrender, tajak, tajak.
True enough, as we translated these stories into narratives and performances, I felt myself transformed into a medium inhabited by the stories of all those who can barely carry the burden of what they had to go through.
Una nilang binaril si Papa. Hinarangan ko naman si mama ko eh. Kaya lang tinulak ako nung isang lalaki.
On the stage of Taupo, only one body is visible, mine. But it is not just me who is speaking. In the play, and now in this film, you will hear the anguished hearts of a whole country, my own included.
Hi, so my name is Kira. I am the co-founder of Undi 18. So I think it started when I was in university. One day, one of my seniors actually said that, hey, I am going to do an Orang Asli trip this weekend. Like, do you want to come along with me? So I went in, I saw how what kind of program that could be done. So we did art programs, we did literacy programs, and we also brought medical supplies and things like that. And I just realized that, again, like, you know, I'm able to afford to live in a city, I'm able to pursue what I want to study and things like that. And I'm just like, okay, how can I use my energy and my time for something good? Since then, I was always very interested in encouraging people to speak up and getting people to run for leadership positions. Tarma and I were in a student organization called the Malaysian Students Global Alliance. Tarma is my co-founder. So through the organization, we had a network of about 16, 17 student organizations around the world who were all headed by Malaysian students. With that said, we came up with a sort of a memorandum to ask the then Prime Minister to consider lowering the voting age, and we got the support of 16 student organizations and youth organizations to also put their name on it. When we launched on social media, coming up saying that, hey, this is what young people want. We represent this group of young people and we want this law to be changed. We graduated university, came back to Malaysia, started speaking to politicians on both sides. We spoke to young politicians, old politicians. We went to forums, having a really thick face and just be like, excuse me, YB, I have a question. What do you think about lowering the voting age? We started speaking to teachers, students. We ran focus groups. We even ran forums and all these awareness events. So we tried our best to show that yes, there's actually a huge interest from the public to see the voting age being lowered. And then we started speaking to politicians, and when the election happened, and it was on the Pakatan Harapan's manifesto, the Minister of Youth and Sports, YB Said Sadiq, made it his mission to push it through cabinet and started lobbying officially as the minister to all the MPs and senators.
Comunidad Bangsasalam project is a project that aims to educate, facilitate, and organize community to a shared performance to have a culture of peace.
From the word itself, Comunidad Bangsasalam, it is a community that brings a nation of peace. I see it as a bridge because it connects the artists and the local community. The local community were able to share ano yung gusto nila. Tapos, we artists, kung ano yung gusto natin na bigay for them to be able na maidala sa taas.
It is also a way to educate and train youth to be leaders.
And also help the students and the people to think that there are a lot of possibilities that peace is possible, that every individual can help in promoting peace.
Na kung saan talaga po yung dala is peace, kapayapaan. So ganda i-share sa ibang tao na this is what we want, parang this is how we achieve peace.
Oh. Here's our public intellectuals, JK, Tina, Joe, Christian, Rafi, Charis, Ryan, May, Alon, Gayatri, and Kira. To get to know them better, we are inviting everyone to talk with our panelists or our public intellectuals for today. So please feel free to type questions in the Q&A box and indicate if you have a particular public intellectual in mind for your question. So while waiting, we can probably start with a few questions. So first, I would like to ask, how did the pandemic change the state of politics in the Philippines and Malaysia? So perhaps we'll start with the Philippine context. May I call on Christian to share your thoughts on this question?
All right, thanks, Carlos, for this opportunity to share some of our experiences here in the Philippines. I think it's no big surprise how the pandemic has affected the way we do politics here in the Philippines. But I guess I'd like to speak as a journalist whose job, whose work, whose role in society or in a democracy has been directly affected, not just by the pandemic, but also by the way this administration has been dealing with journalists under President Rodrigo Duterte. So I think the pandemic gave him the perfect opportunity to actually tighten the noose around journalists and independent media or critical media here in the Philippines, which of course was just an ideal prior to the pandemic, because now, if you talk about people in government, people under this administration who really wanted to take control of the narrative, to get hold of the microphone, so to speak, metaphorically and also literally, the pandemic has given them the perfect excuse. So in my case, I would like to even describe this as the calamity against the free press and also democracy here in the Philippines. And this could actually also provide a template of source for other leaders with authoritarian tendencies to actually make use of this template, which is being used or employed now here in the Philippines to control media further and also limit the democratic space here in the Philippines. So what do I mean? How have we felt this so far in the Philippines? For example, before it was unimaginable for any sitting administration to actually shut down any news network in the Philippines, but under President Duterte, he actually succeeded in shutting down the biggest and arguably the most influential news organization in the Philippines. And that particular action by the president was not just aided by his sheer conviction or resolve to do that, but also that was aided in large measure by the pandemic, because somehow the pandemic limited the opportunity for people to push back, even if they wanted to. That quite literally stopped them from holding rallies or protests against that action by the government. And also that gave them the advantage of, the government or the administration got the advantage of controlling the narrative further, because not only do they hold the microphone, they also have vast resources in terms of controlling the narrative. They have their paid trolls, they have their propagandists, their spin masters, their paid communicators to be able to control the narrative further. And also you're seeing this in terms of how this administration has been trying to control the damage. I would like to see this as more of a self-inflicted damage by this administration in terms of handling the pandemic in the Philippines. Of course, there's no such thing as a perfect template or guidebook or playbook in terms of how a government is supposed to handle this particular pandemic. But it's also safe to somehow compare the way the Philippine government has been handling this pandemic compared with our neighbors. The usual excuse coming from this government is that, of course, the contexts are different. That's fine, that's true. But there are certain things that are lacking if we are to compare how our neighbors here in Southeast Asia have been performing. For example, in terms of greater access to vaccines, in terms of dealing with the communication issues or communication part of this public health crisis, and also quite literally the so-called calamity of disinformation or misinformation, and also the way the government wanted to control the narrative is seen because of the limitations caused by the pandemic. For instance, just recently, you can see this on Twitter now, the way Malacanang or the palace has been trying to control the exchange or the questions during press conferences, because everything is online largely. So our presidential spokesman, on at least 2 occasions, this is the topic now on Twitter. Of course, he's denying this, but the impression, or I think it's apparent that that Malacanang has been trying to control the audio. That's quite flimsy. That's quite lame. But that is how far this administration is willing to go to, just to make sure that the narrative is well under its control. I'm not even talking about the traditional ways by which any sitting government has been trying to control the narrative in a democracy, meaning, for example, any sitting administration can also provide moles or paid hacks within the mainstream media. But of course, because of the resources that have been available to the government, to this administration, they are trying to push the envelope further, and you could see that with the way the government officials have been dealing with people, with critics, with media. So if you talk about this, I think it's not unfair to say that we're undergoing a calamitous incident here in the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. Now, perhaps we can shift to Malaysia. Joe, what can you say about the state of politics and how it was affected by the pandemic in Malaysia?
Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much, DDS, for bringing us together to talk through all these matters. Listening to Christian, I feel I want to say there are a lot of similarities, of course, maybe not just in the Philippines and in Malaysia, but maybe other countries in the world where it is about, I think we feel that governments are trying to control this narrative, and the pandemic becomes kind of an excuse, playing on people's fears to kind of create a stronger narrative of why they need to have so much control. I think in Malaysia, of course, the start of the pandemic also coincided with the coup that happened last February, 12 months ago now, and the legitimacy that government had to claim in the hearts and minds of people. And I think this has been very tied up, I think, for us with the experience of how the pandemic has changed the state of politics in Malaysia. So the pandemic and the coup, I think, have kind of gone hand in glove with each other. And sometimes it's hard to sort of understand certain decisions being made by the government, whether or not this is actually in order to show up their legitimacy, or in fact, it's because they are trying to deal with a national coup. So it's been quite an eventful year, I think, for all of us, and with a lot of, I think, what we would regard as being damage to democracy in some way. Most recently, of course, being the state of emergency that was called, where I think it's worrying to think that an emergency can be called, and the role of the ruler becomes a changed concept and a larger than perhaps we think it should be in a parliamentary Westminster styled parliamentary democracy. So I think this is something that's slightly worrying about, well, if the ruler is making such strong decisions for the country. So it's been quite fractious. What's been going on in Parliament has been quite fractious. So we've had a state where they've declared a state of emergency and say, well, therefore Parliament can't sit. And I think this has created a lot of distrust in people. I mean, when the vaccine arrived in Malaysia a few days ago, and a number of ministers went to the airport to, meet the vaccine, and other people in politics went as well. I think Ambika Srinivasan, who is, an activist in Malaysia, said on Twitter, well, since there's so many of them going to the airport, why don't they hold a session of parliament there, right? So, whereas we've been told that they cannot hold a parliamentary session. So I think this has been a real, a great damage to our democracy that this is ongoing, and people feel quite helpless in trying to challenge this. And of course, the other thing which I think happened in the last 1 year of great concern, I think, you know, kind of a very patriarchal approach to politics, the use of the Prime Minister calling himself Abba to the population and trying to essentially say, well, I'm here to take care of you, and to create a kind of an us and them narrative. So we saw an increase in kind of xenophobia, a lot of xenophobic attacks online and in on the streets, Rohingya grass cutters, for example, being attacked by citizens, a lot of migrant workers being arrested by the police, often for actually no legal reason, but people taking the law into their own hands. And of course, this is not something which can, I think a lot of migrants on the streets feel they have no recourse to any kind of real they have nowhere to go to kind of get their narrative heard. So there are things like this, and then of course with the things the lockdowns have happened all year. I think Dr. Jomo pointed this out as well earlier when he said, well, do we need these lockdowns? I think this is a big question we have here. Are the lockdowns politically motivated, or were they based on science? Now the changes in the conditions or the SOPs of the lockdown, again, we wonder, well, are they based on science, or are they based on economics? So there's a lot of distrust, I think, about how things are being handled. There's also been, for example, just last week, I think it was, that the news portal Malaysia Kini was fined an exorbitant sum of money by the courts for contempt of court for articles in their news portal, not for the article themselves, but because of comments by readers. Now, this is something I think people need to discuss, whether or not actually comments should be moderated. But I think what was more telling was the fact that the fine was really, really hefty. But what you also saw was that Malaysians within half a day had contributed towards Malaysia Kini for them to pay that fine. So, you see then people kind of deciding, well, hold on, that doesn't sound right, that doesn't sound just, and trying to take matters into their own hand as well. And maybe just finally, I would say that just a few days ago, the deportation of 1,200 Myanmar nationals back to Myanmar, despite advocates who worked very hard to get the courts to stay the deportation, and then the Department of Immigration, the Home Ministry, allowed the Myanmar Navy to actually deport these nationals. And so again, it kind of creates a sensation that other courts have no power. I mean, who are making who's making the decisions? And they're very small voices, I think, in this big storm, trying to advocate for the rights of minorities, such as refugees, such as migrant workers, because of this larger fear that's kind of seized hold of the country of, well, we need to get ourselves better first. So I think this whole narrative, I feel that I noticed this year is trying to create this division between those who are seen as being Malaysians and Malaysian nationals, and those who are seen as being foreigners, migrants and refugees. And even when they announced the rollout of the vaccination, they made a point to say, oh, this vaccination will be given to everybody, even if you are a migrant worker. And so this was applauded. But my question was, well, isn't that just basic human rights to give this vaccine to everybody who lives in the country? It makes sense to do this. But in fact, it was kind of presented as a you see how good we're being. We're even giving it to those people who may not deserve it, but we're going to do it for them. And I think this also creates a very bad narrative for us, I think, in terms of democracy, where we see civil rights as being something which are allowed to Malaysians, but not allowed to people who are living in Malaysia. And I think that's a very important thing that needs to be addressed.
Thank you very much, Jo. Kira? Would you like
Yeah,
to
I
add
don't think I'll
anything?
add so much because Joe has painted a very accurate picture of how Malaysia has been impacted by the pandemic. But I think specifically, I want to just add on and emphasize that the pandemic has been highly politicized here in Malaysia by our politicians on both sides. I think, many times the opposition here assumes that just because the government is not doing well, that people will automatically vote the opposition. But many times CSOs have reached out to the opposition to just ask, can you put together a shadow cabinet, come up with policies to actually counter the government? But clearly the opposition is still not even organized enough to be able to provide a solid opposition, which is very worrying if the election is going to be called this year, that they will not be able to form a strong enough coalition to counter the narratives that the government coalition is currently putting out. The moment that the government, there were few government MPs that has announced that they are losing confidence in the PM. Literally the day after, our Prime Minister went to the King to request for an emergency, and what happens is that the emergency is very different from the first time that Malaysia had declared emergency back in 1969, if I'm not mistaken, where there were racial riots. This time, the emergency was touted, was requested using COVID as a reason. However, weirdly enough, every sector of business is allowed to operate. Kids are allowed to go to school now, and yet the only thing that the emergency is stopping is our parliament to convene. Which means that, again, opposition and the Malaysian people have lost out on one avenue and mechanism to keep the government in check. And it also opens up space for emergency ordinances to be passed in Malaysia, and it can affect, so many things like our human rights, media freedom, and all the incidences that Joe has pointed out. We cannot debate about this in Parliament, even if we have members of Parliament who are who wants to question this, either whether they are on the opposition or on the government side. I think specifically zooming in on young people in Malaysia, the impact of the pandemic, I think, has impacted us heavily, with our unemployment rate being one of the highest in decades because of the pandemic. Young people are often the first one to be let go by businesses and by companies, and then of course, we have so many students who are struggling just to keep up with classes because we really lack accessibility for online learning. So that in turn, from a political lens, it will impact youth apathy it will increase youth apathy a lot, especially with the Undi 18 bill recently that has been rumored to not be implemented this year. We have met the ministers, both Minister and Deputy Minister of Youth, and they have indirectly saying that it will be delayed, and they have no plans to actually rush, or they are not willing to give a commitment that it will be on track in terms of implementation, which means that if an election which looks to be in the interests of many political parties except the opposition to be conducted this year, many young people will be left out from the discussion. Not to mention, if to hold the election in the pandemic is extremely dangerous, and it would turn off many Malaysian diaspora, not even Malaysian diaspora overseas, but also Borneo diaspora, Borneo voters who are living here in West Malaysia. So this would further disenfranchise many Malaysian voters to participate in our democracy. And I think last but not least, one of the key aspect, area of democracy that Malaysia impacted is we cannot, like the regular people, it's very difficult for us to challenge or question the emergency that has been implemented, because any point to question the emergency would equate to be questioning the king. And if you question the king, or if you insult the king in any way here in Malaysia, you would automatically be arrested under the Sedition Act, which means that, and also not to mention that because the king is in the constitution is also the Islamic leader of the country, it would also, you would also be, basically you'll be insulting many things, the king, the religion, our leaders, and so on and so forth. So it leaves a lot of even many CSO organizations being very concerned and being afraid to speak up. I know recently a few CSOs like Bersih, CIJ, Suaram have launched a court challenge about the emergency, but many CSOs were hesitant to add their name to it because they are worried that their members and their communities will equate it as challenging the king, which is it can be even considered a sin for the Muslim community. And last but not least, I think just through the DDS grant, we have tried our best to tackle the issue of youth apathy. we realized that, especially even by organizing webinars or conferences, it would lead to fatigue among young people. So we try our best to produce animated content where, even someone kids as young as 10 years old would be able to grasp these concepts easily. And I think the biggest challenge moving forward in preparation for a general election is that people don't see the value of voting anymore, because so much of what happened the past 2 years we've seen politicians hopped over, we've seen politicians switch alliances multiple times over, sometimes within the span of one day, and I think this just leaves a very demotivating environment for Malaysian democracy to thrive.
Thank you, Keela. When we started the project, that was in 2019, we never expected that there'll be a pandemic and there'll be lockdowns. So maybe the next question we should ask, although the lockdowns were basically unnecessary, specifically this last one that has been imposed on Malaysia. Oh, by the way, we're not yet also free from our lockdown here. Maybe the question here would be how the pandemic and how the lockdown has affected your initiatives in particular, or the movements that will promote the democratic discourse and democratization in each of the countries. Maybe we can ask JK.
Hello, hello, good morning. Thank you very much for your wonderful sharing, everybody. I'm JK, and I'm a performance maker working in various communities in different parts of the Philippines. Definitely, performance is about gathering, and it's also about, for us to have a collective imagination, the conditions for gathering is necessary. So that was greatly affected by the pandemic, no? And also the threat to democracy and peace became more apparent as last year in Marawi, for example, where we closely collaborate with the young people there. There were threats of ISIS attacking a hospital. So during at the time of pandemic, no. So our initiatives in performance making, it eventually became an SOP for a lot of performance makers working closely with different communities. That the first order is for us to create conditions for access to support for our immediate needs. We work in the live events. Technically, our work is in liveness and shared presences. So we had to we have to learn new capacities, and so that was the first thing that we did in the beginning of the pandemic, for us to be able to continue telling necessary stories, necessary narratives. It led to better opportunities. It opened. Being online created like a floodgate. It was like a floodgate of bringing in new audiences, being interested in the narratives that we're creating and presenting. So as much as it's very challenging to create work within or with communities, on the ground, we were trying to migrate and create and articulate new ways of hybrid ways of performance making online. But being online also excludes a lot of people, no? So not a lot of people can access these works online, and we acknowledge that. And so the other way to do it is to create toolkits and to capacitate and work immediately with leaders or movers and shakers in these hyper localities. Some of the initiatives continue to prosper just because people are having these bubbles, in these communities. But it is really, really challenging. But for example, when you are outside Metro Manila, the general sentiment of the public is that there's no COVID, it seems normal. It's too difficult to wear masks, and so people feel like we're not in COVID situation anymore. And of course, there's also this narrative that hospitals just try to get money from the people. So that is like the sentiment of the general public. So we have to take into consideration these protocols when we're on the ground. So but at the same time, I think it's a time that we were pushed. We were, what do you call that? We were made to work closely with different agencies. I worked with the Department of Education to create like all this content online, while we are also working with NGOs who are working closely. So performance is no longer just making performance, but also it also we need to address access to support, care, mental health care support, and needs of the people online or on the ground. So that shift was necessary, as much as we are also shifting our ways of creating. Thank you.
JK, I understand the difficulties in terms of reaching out to an audience that is, in the first place, in an area that has already been affected by an armed conflict in the past, and is much more affected by any of these lockdowns given the pandemic. Maybe we can go to our colleague, a public intellectual in Malaysia, Gayatri.
Hi, thanks, Ronnie. I was trying to figure out, would we be able to at least bring up some, positive outcomes out of this? And it's a bit difficult to do that. It's really sort of scraping at the barrel. But maybe just to start off by saying that I think given the fact that the project that I had proposed involved students and also their counterparts in whether different associations or different universities. And so the learning curve to move it online was much shorter than one would have expected, say working with different communities. So I think that's the plus point, that to be able to shift some of the things, as we had discussed earlier also with the project, it didn't take a very long time, or the sort of adaptation. And I think kudos to the young people who are much quicker at learning things, and also understanding the ecosystem a little bit better. But I would say that it's also an issue of reflection. Many years ago, a friend of mine who was attending in my work in civil society, we are always told that when we organize things, there are always usual suspects who turn up at different events. And I and I said that I think it's not about usual suspects, that we are not talking to the others. I think that in order to internalize democratic values, to internalize human rights, it takes a long time, because we are shifting, mindsets, we are shifting hopefully behavior and choices as well. That you could go to different artistic performances, human rights training. It takes time to internalize a lot of these values and ideas. And for me, it wasn't that we were not talking to the others, that it was more of building our own sense of confidence in making those calls, when it comes to human rights and democracy. And this is, I think, one of the biggest challenges, I think, in the last year, because as we had designed the program, it was meant to bring forward groups of students or young people through the different sets of activities. So, you had the opportunities to brainstorm and bring out whatever you felt was the core issues that you are frustrated by and think is important, and then work through that through the other processes as well, to meet different stakeholders, to then say what it is then that we need from the perspective of media, from social media conversations. So we have not been able to do that because I think it does require the face-to-face interactions, because we want to have that level of trust and confidence. So as much as we can organize things online, we are unable to build enough of that sense of confidence and trust. And it's not because people are not, it's not because people are camera shy or don't want to say what they want, what they think, but it is about the confidence of saying, this is what we want to aim for. We believe in this, that we can bring forward these arguments. It's a process on its own. So I would say that's probably one of the biggest challenges that has arisen. And I think Kira did mention, this point about the fatigue, right? Because everything now is done online. And I would add one more point there, that we come to know a lot of our students and their friends, and the backgrounds in which they come from and the settings they are in. And sometimes discussing issues that are politically important for them involve identities, involve their own interests, partisan politics. but they struggle with that with their families. And to be able to discuss this, actually sometimes taking them out from that situations to another place is why the face-to-face is very important, right? But to get them to speak about it within the confines of where the source of their pressure is makes it very difficult. And so trying to elicit some of the feedback, maybe strategies, a little bit more challenging. So, you know, we have had to explore this issue of what is indeed a safe space, right? They are at home, but it's not necessarily safe for them. We do know a lot of our students struggle in many ways, even joining our classes. So this is something that I think maybe has, you know, it's something that requires us to understand better, because being able to express freely is so critical and so crucial to the democratic process. But that this whole year has exposed to us how that has actually really been curtailed. To move out of your house and go to the university is an act of gaining freedom actually for many students as well. And so that has come to, you know, it's a bit difficult to think about that. So, you know, also this idea, I think JK also said, how do we provide that kind of mental health support has to be built in. And I suppose the third one is, or maybe just the last one, you know, we started off thinking about what are the broader issues, but because of the pandemic, that has skewed a lot of priorities. So a lot of the discussions then are, you know, sort of shaped by the pandemic. So, which is not a bad thing on its own, but I think then we have maybe stepped away from some of the issues that they began to talk about, you know, that were important to them. But I think it allowed us also to raise some of these other issues through the lens of the pandemic. So inequalities, the ethnic markers, the kind of nationalism that also Joe talked about in terms of our reactions towards migrants and refugees. So it's, you know, it skewed the priority, but it also served as an interesting lens or useful lens to discuss some of the other issues. So I think those are some of my sort of main, you know, reflections of how it affected the work. As I said, we do want to see what some of the upsides are, while we understand that, you know, there've been a lot of challenges also.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I understand the challenges also in Malaysia, compounded by the fact that, you know, when you started the projects, the political situation was much better.
Yes, it was so hopeful.
No one even anticipated a coup in a hotel that led to a change in government, and subsequently, you know, a lockdown order that lasts until what, August 1st. And I think the situation is similar also here in the Philippines, and maybe we can ask another Philippine public intellectual, Rafi. How was your project affected?
Oh, definitely it was affected. No one could have thought that the pandemic will last even this long. We had one of the longest lockdowns in the world, and we're still not there's no vaccines yet. So, but rather that I would not rather go to the problems, but I think it's more of how people have changed or adapted, and you thought of other ways to be creative in trying to show your work. Of course, everything now is online, but you still miss that connection with face to face. So you just have to adapt. Of course, with my work, I have to be in the field. I'm a photographer. So it forced me. It really forced me to. I think the first months were paralyzing, but well, you just have to adapt and find ways of doing your work without endangering other people too. But it's been a learning experience too. I was never really like, for example, I was never really in social media. I don't even have Facebook. I was only in Instagram. But because of the pandemic too, I knew I had to reach a bigger audience. That's when I started tinkering with Twitter. Before I just read the news through Twitter, but now I'm trying to get involved too with it in Twitter, trying to reach other audiences. I used to do lots of talks face to face. Because of online, well, it's smaller audiences, but I made it a point to make myself more available, even for small groups, to talk about what's happening here. But my this project was supposed to be a public exhibit, so I'll have to think of ways if I would go online or make it private, or so we're still adjusting. Basically, we're still adjusting to the situation up to this day. But I would also like to point out that because of the COVID the pandemic, it also brought it gave focus again to human rights. I think more people are talking about more people began to talk about human rights because now we share the same experience of what's happening, especially in our situation, and I guess and of course in Malaysia too, that because people are getting affected and their civil liberties are being trampled upon, and that's something that I took note of because of what I'm doing is now in the war on drugs and how government has been conducting their war on drugs, very punitive. And in the same way, I try to link it to what's happening with the pandemic too. That the government has been using this strategy, but is it effective? And of course, it is a health issue, and we should treat the drug issue as a health problem too, and try to put people in that mindset and see if government is responding and if it's effective. And of course, up to now, we see that what's happening now with the COVID-19 pandemic, it's not effective. And this is based on data, this is based on science. Authoritarian leaders have not been doing a great job on dealing with the pandemic. So I try to find ways and trying to link it to what I'm doing, to the project I'm doing in the war on drugs. So yeah.
Yeah, although we're still hopeful, Rafi, that as soon as we're MGCQ, we can hold the exhibit.
Yeah.
And it's good to find out that you have been converted into a Gen Z digital native with your Facebook page.
I try.
Some of our public intellectuals also confronted some other forms of harassment also. I don't know whether this is true also for Ryan. Ryan?
Yes. Harassment is something that we have dealt with a lot. And first, I just want to agree with Rafi that in the pandemic, social media is so indispensable for Queer Lapis, especially because for the LGBT community in Malaysia, we've been experiencing a lot of pushback, I would say, recently in the pandemic. And this harassment is targeted not just organizationally for Queer Lapis, but for so many LGBTQ people. Quite recently, there have been posts sort of linking LGBTQ people to the pandemic and even blaming them. And there was this unfortunate post which had 20,000 shares. Luckily, it's been taken down now after Queer Lapis has sort of exposed it, sort of linking how, or like accusing LGBTQ people of causing the pandemic. So all these discourses, and with what Joe mentioned about migrants, we sort of see this scapegoating happening, where we see that the state is probably unable to cope with the pandemic and just shifting their attention towards minority groups like migrants and refugees and LGBTQ people. And it's quite saddening to see because there's also this larger issues, and COVID didn't create these issues, but it did exacerbate a lot of these issues. And we see like the curtailing of freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And when we saw that the state cracked down on refugees and migrants and rounded them up to put to detention centers. We saw a lot of netizens actually cheering and sort of thanking authorities and looking towards them as sort of father figures. And when there were discussions of tanks coming out and the military coming out, plenty of the rakyat were glad to see this happen. So it's quite perplexing for people who are working in democracy and human rights. All of these discourses definitely like work against what we're trying to do, which is to create discourses on LGBTQ human rights and freedom of expression. We also saw police reports lodged against our staff and our writers for exposing cooperation therapy camps. And more related to the pandemic, there were plenty of roadblocks, and we sort of exposed some police officers who at roadblocks created to sort of contain the pandemic, harassing LGBTQ people and checking their phones and looking at their private messages. People living with HIV attempting to procure their medicine, stopped at roadblocks and questioned and forced to turn back. So this pandemic has really impacted LGBTQ people and the movement as a whole. And also the act of asking for rights and to just holding the government accountable. It's been very difficult because the moment you say that the government is doing something wrong, people will just say, well, COVID is more important and we should just listen to the government. So that is something that we've been trying to deal with. But to end on a positive note, throughout this pandemic, we've been pushing for decriminalization. And although it's been difficult with all of this happening, yesterday the federal court made a landmark decision to take down the law against unnatural sex in Selangor for Muslim people. But even then, now certain parties are brewing plans to undo this. So we're sort of taking it as it comes.
Thank you very much, Ryan. So we've been talking about challenges because of the pandemic. Now we move on to, I wanted to ask some of our public intellectuals how in their respective advocacies, in your respective advocacies in promoting democratic discourse, how would you move forward from all of these challenges and to what could be done to stop any further slides towards autocratization within this context wherein the public is more concerned with their physical health and material survival. So perhaps we can start with May. May, is there any? I think there's something wrong with your audio.
No, May.
Just how's that?
Yeah.
Is it better?
Yes.
Hello? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hello? Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's better.
Sorry. So I'll say I'm May. I'm an actor, performance activist, and a cook. In the DDSPI activity, I was supposed to be performing a theater piece and going around the Philippines. But because of the pandemic, it actually changed. So now, instead of performing live in front of audiences, I have actually transferred the play into a film. And I would like to think in some level, it is an upgrade because there is a limit to how many audiences I can reach when I do theater. If I perform to a theater that can accommodate like 50 or 1,000 or 2,000, I'm talking in terms of that many numbers. No? But now as a film where I am hoping to reach a wider audience, then I think I can even reach more. And my play is actually about extrajudicial killings. These are 4 narratives. And whenever I perform this on stage, the best part of the piece is actually the talkback. Because whenever I have a talkback is when I get people to give their insights, their reactions, their questions, and I get to engage with the audience, which I continue to do even as I do it online. And I think the beauty of that part of Tao Po is that this is where I feel that consciousness is being changed. The engagement between the actor and the audience and the rest of the creatives is just so palpable that you actually get to feel, you get to hear. I mean, there is an emergent dialogue and people actually listen to each other. And I think here it sparks something. I see a start of transformation because the kind of discussion sparked by a performance of Tao Po has always been very deep. I remember a favorite of Rafi Lerma, who's also one of the characters in Tao Po, is a senior citizen who actually watched us in Baguio, who actually through tears was saying sorry that this all happened, you know. But she had no idea of how deep it has gone. And right there she said sorry. And it was I really felt the transformation in that woman as it actually also and how she is able to deeply affect me. And I think if we really want to change what is happening in our country, I truly believe that engagement is possible. The problems of our country happen in the real world. While now we are actually engaging online, I mean, our social media networks work for us, and it is a very good platform to reach out to people. I think as much as we do our work online, there also has to be corresponding work offline. And when I say offline, I also mean that if there is something we want to change in our outer world, there is also so much that we need to change in our inner world, and that we should be able to establish the connections to all the people that we want to affect. And by people we want to affect, I mean to include those who are not part of the choir. Because I always say this, there is no point in converting the converted. And I really make extra effort to talk to not the DDS, the Democracy Discourse Series, but the other DDS who I feel should be part of the conversation. And this is when you allow yourself to be vulnerable, you allow yourself to be humble, and you're actually listening to them. Because I think taking off from the keynote a while ago, where it is so important for us to get our act together, to actually be able to unite and to set our differences aside so that we can really serve humanity, I think is really very, very important. And I think this is also the power of art, because when you do something as creative as, say, for example, a poem or a dance or a performance, you actually go straight to the core of the matter. You speak to their hearts. And I think that is really, really important. That is why I value the importance of how art is so crucial in the transformation, not only of consciousness, but of society. And if we do not want to spiral down even more, I think we should keep on working on our connectedness. Because I think if we are able to do this, the future conversing with us, we can actually have a brighter future. And now, even as an advocate where I go to rallies, I mean, I am against the terror law, or I am for rights of the LGBTQ. I also do something really that affects the gut. I have a community kitchen, and what we do is we give food to the homeless, we give food to to people, persons deprived of liberty. We give to urban poor communities. We give to people affected by disaster, and this has been very, very fulfilling, because while I do something that is like something really artful as I perform on stage, I also do something as an activist that actually addresses the gut issue. And I know that whenever I go to places where I serve a hot meal and they crowd themselves, and they will always run to the food and with their eyes really smiling and excited. I'm always reminded that their problem is not COVID, but hunger. And to know that I am able to give something to help alleviate hunger means a lot to me as an advocate. And I will continue that as I do my performances on stage, as I continue to show tao po, and as I continue to feed the community. I mean, I feel that this is my way of connecting to the problems of the world, and I thank DDS, this DDS, for allowing me to make this possible. So thank you.
Thank you very much, May. Now we can proceed to Tina to talk about her advocacy on media literacy and misinformation research on misinformation, and how it can help stop or deter autocratization.
Yeah, I think because my work is mainly in the online spaces, I focus on encouraging people to embrace emerging online tools, online platforms, whether it's TikTok or Clubhouse app that's really popular right now, or whether it's online multiplayer games like Among Us or Animal Crossing. It's easy to saturate these new spaces with chaos and extremist views if there are no rational voices, especially at the very start. And I know that it's asking a lot from journalists and academics and policymakers and healthcare workers who are already working around the clock. Many of them are frontliners. But the fact of the matter is most people are on those platforms as a form of escapism from the hard reality that we're all facing together, right, to cope with the pandemic. But that's where you also can be at your most vulnerable, because your guard is down, because you think that you've escaped the real world, you've escaped reality. So you can't let these spaces be void of rational pro-democracy voices. And we're already seeing proof in the pudding. We see really popular rooms in the Clubhouse app where conversations around vaccine hesitancy involving actual experts, including, for instance, our Minister of Science, who's in charge of the vaccine rollout in the country, seeing prominent experts who seem like, mere figureheads previously, but actually being able to directly interact with them without the bureaucracy, seeing them behaving like actual normal human beings, playing an online game or making TikTok videos, and forming that parasocial relationship with them kind of humanizes them and makes the information exchange more constructive. And also, it works both ways because it helps restore the public trust in the media, in policymaking, in academia. And at the same time, it also gives the media, gives the policymakers and academics real-time insights into what the public sentiment is about, whatever it is that's going on. Like in the opening speech by the Vice President, who said that it's solidarity in real time, right, with real stories and real connections. And of course, there's still room for the old-fashioned traditional press conferences and nationwide broadcasts on public TV for the heavier, meatier stuff. But the point is that you won't get people tuning into those broadcasts if they're not invested already in what you want to say. And maybe they still won't be tuning in, but at least you get your message across on those platforms that they're already on. And the most important thing is you're not leaving those spaces, these new online spaces, being monopolized by radical extremists who can threaten democracy. And I know I recognize that there's a limit to this. I think JK and a few other PIs also mentioned about how, obviously internet penetration is an issue, especially in rural areas, and it is being made more glaring now because with online schools and working remotely from home, but it also means that there's more incentive for the governments, for telco companies to improve internet connectivity, and we can capitalize on that, therefore potentially allowing more people to access these platforms and tools. So, I mean, it's just one of the many ways to address potential democratic backsliding. Let's not focus on the negative.
Thank you very much, Tina. Now, Alon, could you talk a little bit more about your work on theater and community development and how it can further advance democratic values?
Yeah, I think I'm taking off from hearing everyone's experiences and ideas. As with regards to the Gobierno project, because one of the intention was also to archive the performances that was done for the past 5 years, and going through the process of seeing the videos, like taking us back to like how it was the journey of us, of the artists of the team. There was a sort of a reflection that what Gobierno wanted was in the sense of a performance is to do collective action and like influence social change, but at the same time reflecting that the Gobierno project also influenced us, the artists, to transform in a sense, that most of us are like actors, writers, filmmakers, doing the work within the realm of theater and performance. But the idea is also that individually we sort of transformed and shifted our our concerns to the actual, grassroots spaces or communities. So I think that's one of the realization, that taking off from I guess Gayatri, like saying that the change happens also, it has to be internalized, like a lot of values, and it takes time to build a sense of confidence and trust. I think going out of the performance space or the theater took a lot of courage and also a lot of confidence and trust within oneself, and involving in activism or in advocacies. So I guess taking off from that, to address the this autocratization, I think what's important is just to continue the conversation, and I guess continue creating and presenting and highlighting the narratives of those that are affected, and I think that has a bearing on their condition. I think that's what Dr. Jo mentioned earlier. And then it's, I think what's important also is reclaiming the narratives, or the good narratives or the positive narratives, because of all this disinformation, this misinformation. And one important thing is like demanding accountability and continue questioning the authorities and the policies, and also showing solidarity to those who are affected and are attacked. Here in the Philippines, we have the anti-terror law, that's supposed to be like against terrorism, but it's attacking human rights advocates, human rights defenders, farmers, artists. So we just have to continue on showing solidarity to us, to them, in a sense. And taking off also from my position, like I'm in the province, we're in sort of a lockdown. My only participation is online, and engaging with the people online. But I guess there are people who or organizations who can do the things on the ground. So it's a matter of showing your support or showing how you can help them in ways um, other than being just present. But something like that. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Alan. I remember New Narrative released as sort of collaborated with also Filipino artists to do something about anti-terrorism bill, right? Charis, would you like to talk a little bit about your project for DDS and how it could help stop or deter autocratization in these times wherein almost everyone is concerned with pandemic? I think there's an audio, Charis. There might be a problem with your audio.
Okay, how about now? All right, great. Yeah, so I think I'll talk about what we did with the Filipino artists first before I go to the DDS project. What we were doing then was we were trying to find a way in which we could respond quickly to current events, because New Narrative as a platform is built around long form journalism and evergreen pieces. So we don't report breaking news. We're focusing more on topics that we think will come up again and again. But we also needed a way to, when the law was almost about to be passed, that we needed a way to have a response to that. And we decided that what we would do was to ask artists to just make short comics or illustrations responding to how they felt about it, to also highlight to our readership that it's not just journalists or academics who are sources of knowledge. Ordinary people and like artists, their points of view are also important. And I think that ties into this whole concern about stopping the slide towards autocratization, because if people feel that their voices are not important, then they stop participating in conversations and in the discourse. So part of why we try to work a lot with artists is also to show artists who maybe have not been making work that's concerned with politics or social issues, to show them that like, it is possible to do this. Like, you don't need to be an activist in order to say something about these things. So moving on to like the DDS projects, where we were making comics about voter education and indigenous rights in Malaysia. I think the first thing to address about the question is like it's also not a dichotomy between democracy and people being concerned with their health and survival. Like they can do both at the same time. And I think we've seen that in the past year where, I mean, even recently we've seen people who've been out on the streets protesting in Myanmar, in Thailand, in Indonesia, in the middle of a pandemic. So it's clearly not that they don't care about democracy, or they don't care about, or they care more about their health than democracy. Like both of it can happen at the same time. So what we try to do is by making comics that highlight these issues, it's doing what Dr. Jomo said, like trying to hold those in power accountable. And to be able to hold them accountable, you need people to understand the topic, to have information about the topic so that they can look at what those in power are doing and ask their own questions. It shouldn't just be, like the journalist trying to hold them accountable. It should be making it so that anyone who wants to find out about the topic can go and read about it in an accessible way and then form their own opinions and questions. And by using comics, I think we're trying to also have an emotional impact more than just presenting facts as they are. So using comics and visuals helps to do that. So I think my last point is kind of, we've seen, a lot of the authoritarian governments try to slip things past us in the middle of the pandemic. So where everyone's concerned with this, they're trying to pass laws, they're trying to undo some of the changes that have been made. So even if the comics are not necessarily focused on the pandemic, what they're doing is reminding people that, hey, there are all these other issues that are also important, and centering that, while we acknowledge that we're in the middle of, a time that's unprecedented. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Charis, and thank you very much to all of our public intellectuals. Let's give them a virtual round of applause. For further details about their work and their background, we invite you to visit the DDS website. So just type in democracydiscourse.org. So here is a quick tour of our website. So,
game tayo ng ano pala, 4.3. Go tayo ng 4.3.
To give his closing remarks, we have invited the director of the De La Salle University Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub, Dr. Fernando A. Santiago Jr. Fernie?
Hello, everyone. Yesterday, we commemorated the restoration of liberal democracy in the Philippines 35 years ago, a commemoration held in the context of creeping authoritarianism and growing inequalities in the country and around the world. Democratic values are not just under threat, they are under attack at present, and there is a need to assert and protect the ideals that we hold dear. A difficult task requiring courage, fortitude, and resolve. But as mentioned by our keynote speaker, it is also important to understand the meaning of democracy and liberalism in our times. We must appreciate the history and observe the transformations, for these concepts are not monolithic. Our keynote speaker also emphasized how these concepts must be appreciated in light of our own conditions and circumstances, not just in the abstract, but based on real world conditions, particularly in the context of those in the margins. This echoes the Vice President's call for empathy in her opening remarks by leaning towards the ground, by listening first, and listening for real. Thus, this discourse has been and continues to be a call for action and reflection, and I hope that with our respective efforts, we will all see healthier and stronger democracies around the world. To Her Excellency Vice President Maria Leonor Herona Robredo, and our keynote speaker, Professor Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram, thank you for your inspiring words. To our public intellectuals from Malaysia and the Philippines, please stay strong, and I wish you all the best in your endeavors. Thank you for taking a stand for democracy. To Dr. Ronald Holmes, Dr. Carlos Piocos, and former Assistant Dean Alan Surla, and the rest of the team, congratulations and more success. To the administrators, faculty, and students of De La Salle University, and our esteemed guests, thank you for joining our event, and I wish you all a pleasant day.
Thank you to everyone. This is where we end the program, and thank you to all of those who attended, and to our keynote speaker and our opening remarks, our keynote speaker. We'll see each other in the next DDS forum.
Thank you.